You've been lied to about emotional exhaustion. They told you it means you're weak, that it means you're failing, that if you were stronger, more disciplined, more in control, you would not feel this drained. But if that were true, why do so many people who hold everything together still feel empty? Why do you wake up tired, even after resting? Why does your mind feel heavy, even in silence? The truth is, emotional exhaustion is not something you fix by pushing harder. It is something you recover from by understanding what has been quietly draining you. And Buddhist teachings reveal a different way. For centuries, they have shown that healing does not come from force. It comes from awareness, from letting go, from no longer carrying what was never yours to hold. Tonight, as you listen to these teachings, something will begin to shift. Your mind will slow down. The pressure inside you will begin to soften. You'll feel a quiet sense of release, like weight gently falling off your shoulders. And when you wake up tomorrow, you may not feel completely new, but you will feel lighter, calmer, clearer, and closer to peace. This isn't just another audio to fall asleep to. This is your path to recover from emotional exhaustion. Are you ready? Let's begin. And now, before we go any deeper, pause for a second. There is a reason you are here, not by accident, not by coincidence, but because something inside you is tired of carrying what it no longer understands. That quiet heaviness you feel, it's not random. It's been trying to speak for a long time. And this is where everything begins to change. Because what if the exhaustion you've been fighting is actually trying to guide you? What if the loss of energy you've been judging is not a weakness, but a signal? Let's go deeper. There is a moment most people never notice. It's subtle, quiet, almost invisible. A task that once felt easy suddenly feels heavy. A conversation that once felt natural now feels draining. A life that once moved with some sense of flow begins to feel like effort everywhere. And the first reaction is always the same. Something is wrong with me. So you try to fix it. You push harder. You motivate yourself. You force your body forward even when your mind is asking for rest. You tell yourself this is just a phase, that you'll snap out of it, that you just need to be stronger. But the more you push, the more the exhaustion deepens, and that's the part that confuses you. Because effort is supposed to solve problems, right? So why does more effort make this worse? Because what you are experiencing is not a lack of energy, it is a misalignment with reality. In Buddhist understanding, the mind and body are not separate from truth. They are constantly reflecting it. When you are in alignment with what is real, energy flows naturally. Not perfectly, not endlessly, but steadily, quietly, without resistance. But when you begin to move against what is real, when you hold on to something that no longer fits, when you force yourself into roles, expectations, or situations that your inner state cannot sustain, energy begins to withdraw, not to punish you, but to stop you. This is the part most people miss. They think exhaustion is a failure of discipline, but it is actually a protection mechanism, a signal that says, this direction is not sustainable. And the body is very honest about this. It does not lie, it does not pretend, it does not negotiate with social expectations or personal pride. If something is too heavy, it will feel heavy. If something is misaligned, it will feel draining. If something is being forced, it will feel exhausting. But the mind, the thinking mind, often refuses to accept this, because the mind has been trained to value pushing over listening. From a young age, you are taught that success comes from effort, that endurance is strength, that stopping is weakness. So when your energy disappears, you don't question the direction, you question yourself. And that is where the real suffering begins, because instead of adjusting your relationship with what you're doing, you start attacking your own capacity. You call yourself lazy. You tell yourself you're not good enough. You compare yourself to others who seem to keep going effortlessly, and in doing so, you add another layer of exhaustion. Not just physical, but emotional. The exhaustion of self-judgment, the exhaustion of feeling like you are the problem. But what if you are not the problem? What if your exhaustion is clarity that you have not yet understood? Because when you look closely, you begin to see patterns. There are things that drain you quickly, even when they seem small. And there are things that give you energy, even when they require effort. The difference is not in the action itself. It is in the alignment behind it. You can spend hours doing something that feels true and feel alive. And you can spend minutes doing something that feels forced and feel completely drained. This is not random. This is your system responding to reality. And Buddhist teachings emphasize this again and again. Suffering does not come from activity. It comes from resistance, from clinging to what does not fit, from trying to make reality match your expectations instead of seeing it clearly. So when your energy disappears, it is not telling you to become stronger. It is asking you to become more honest, to look at where you are forcing yourself, to notice where you are holding on to something out of fear, habit, or obligation, to see where your actions and your inner state are no longer aligned. This is not always easy, because misalignment often hides behind things that seem reasonable. Responsibilities, commitments, roles you've carried for years, identities you've built your life around. The strong one, the reliable one, the one who never breaks. These identities feel important, they feel necessary, but they also come with a cost. Because when you attach yourself to being a certain kind of person, you stop listening to what you actually feel. You begin to act out of expectation instead of truth. And over time, that gap grows until your system can no longer sustain it. And that is when exhaustion appears. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a slow dimming of light. Less motivation, less clarity, less emotional capacity, until even small things feel overwhelming. And still, the mind says, just push a little more. But pushing is what created the problem, because pushing ignores the signal. And the signal is the only thing that can guide you back. So what does it mean to listen? It does not mean quitting everything. It does not mean escaping responsibility. It means observing without immediately reacting. It means noticing where your energy drops without judging it. It means asking simple questions without rushing to answer them. Where do I feel resistance? What am I holding on to that feels heavy? What am I forcing that no longer feels true? These questions are not meant to create panic. They are meant to create awareness, because awareness is the beginning of alignment. And alignment is where energy returns, not because you forced it back, but because you removed what was blocking it. This is a subtle shift, but it changes everything. Instead of trying to increase your energy, you begin to reduce the friction that drains it. You stop fighting the signal and start learning from it. You stop asking, how do I push through this? And start asking, what is this trying to show me? And slowly, something begins to change. You notice that not everything needs to be carried, not everything needs to be fixed, not everything needs your constant involvement. Some things can be released, some expectations can be softened, some roles can be redefined, and in that release, energy begins to return, not all at once, but gently, quietly, like water flowing back into a space that was once blocked. And this is where a deeper understanding begins to form. That energy is not something you create, it is something that flows when there is no resistance. The more you fight, the more it disappears. The more you allow, the more it returns. This is not passivity, it is clarity. It is seeing that forcing yourself into misalignment will never lead to peace, and that listening, even when it feels uncomfortable, is the only way back. Because the truth is, Your exhaustion has been trying to help you. It has been trying to slow you down before something deeper breaks. It has been trying to redirect you before you go too far in the wrong direction. It has been trying to protect you in the only way it knows how, by removing the energy that allows you to continue. And when you begin to see it this way, something softens. You stop fighting yourself. You stop blaming your lack of energy. You stop seeing it as something to overcome. And you start seeing it as something to understand. And in that understanding, there is space. Space to breathe, space to feel, space to realign. Because healing does not begin when you become stronger. It begins when you become more honest. Honest about what you feel. Honest about what drains you. Honest about what no longer fits. And that honesty is not weakness. It is the beginning of clarity. And clarity is the foundation of energy. So if you feel tired right now, deeply tired, don't rush to fix it. Don't rush to escape it. Just sit with the possibility that your exhaustion is not the end of something. It is the beginning of seeing something clearly for the first time. And from that place, everything starts to shift. Not because you forced it, but because you finally listened. And once you begin to listen, really listen, something else starts to reveal itself. Because it's not just what you are doing that drains you, it's also what you are holding in silence. There is a quiet kind of damage that does not leave visible marks. No one sees it, no one hears it, but you feel it. A tightness in your chest that never fully relaxes. A heaviness in your body that has no clear cause. A strange fatigue that follows you even when nothing difficult is happening. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to carry something you never released. Let's go deeper. There is a kind of violence that makes no sound. It does not shout. It does not break things. It does not leave bruises that others can see. But it slowly drains the life out of you. This is the violence of suppressed emotions. From very early in life, most people learn a rule that seems harmless, but shapes everything. Do not feel too much. Do not cry too long. Do not get too angry. Do not show too much sadness. Do not make others uncomfortable with what is happening inside you. So you learn to adjust yourself. You feel something, and immediately you reduce it. You soften your reaction. You hide your expression. You swallow the words that were about to come out. And over time, this becomes automatic. You don't even notice it anymore. You just say, "I'm fine," even when you are not. And this looks like control. It looks like maturity. It looks like strength. But underneath, something is building, because emotions are not things you can store without cost. They are movements. They are processes. They arise, they move, they dissolve, but only if they are allowed to complete themselves. When you interrupt that process, when you stop an emotion halfway, it does not disappear, it stays. Not as a clear feeling anymore, but as tension, as pressure, as something unresolved, and your body holds it. This is why emotional exhaustion is not always loud. It does not always come with breakdowns or obvious distress. Sometimes it is quiet, a constant background weight, a sense that something is off, but you cannot explain what. Because what you are feeling is not just one emotion, it is the accumulation of many. Moments where you wanted to speak, but stayed silent. Times you felt hurt, but acted like it didn't matter. Situations where you needed space, but kept showing up anyway. Each of these moments leaves a trace, and those traces add up. The mind becomes heavier. The body becomes tighter, and energy begins to fade, not because life is too much, but because too much has been left unfinished inside you. This is something Buddhist teachings understand very deeply. They do not see emotions as problems to fix. They see them as natural events, temporary movements of the mind, but only temporary if they are allowed to move. When you resist them, when you push them away, when you deny them, you create what can be called emotional residue, something that lingers beyond its natural lifespan. And the effort it takes to hold that residue in place is what drains you. Think about what it takes to keep something submerged underwater. You have to keep applying pressure. The moment you stop, it rises. That is what suppression is. A constant pressure, a constant effort. And that effort consumes energy. Even when you are doing nothing on the outside, something inside you is working very hard, holding things down, keeping things quiet, maintaining the image that everything is okay, and over time, that becomes exhausting. But here is the part most people do not realize. Suppression does not only affect how you feel, it also affects how clearly you can think. Because when emotions are not allowed to move, they do not just sit quietly. They distort your perception. You become more reactive, even if you don't show it. You become more sensitive, even to small things. You feel overwhelmed without knowing why, because the system is already carrying too much. So even a small addition feels like too much. This is why emotional exhaustion can feel confusing, because your reaction does not always match the situation. Something small triggers something big, and you think, why am I like this? But the answer is not in the moment. It is in what has been building over time. Unfelt sadness, unspoken frustration, unacknowledged disappointment, all waiting, all stored, all quietly draining your energy. And because it has been there for so long, it begins to feel normal. You forget what it feels like to be light, to feel without resistance, to let something pass through you without holding on to it. You get used to carrying, you get used to managing, you get used to being fine. But being fine is often just another form of suppression. It is the middle ground between feeling and not feeling. A controlled version of yourself, safe but heavy. And this is where the quiet violence continues, not because something is attacking you, but because you are constantly denying something within you, not intentionally, not consciously, but habitually. And habits shape experience. So what begins as small moments of suppression becomes a way of being, a way of relating to yourself, where feeling is something to manage instead of something to allow. And this disconnect creates distance between you and your own experience, between what you feel and what you show, between what is true and what is expressed. And maintaining that distance requires energy, a lot of it, because you are constantly monitoring yourself, adjusting yourself, editing yourself. And over time, that becomes too much. This is where the shift begins, not by trying to release everything at once, not by forcing yourself to feel deeply, but by becoming aware of the moments where you stop yourself, where you cut off a feeling, where you quickly move away from discomfort, where you replace a real emotion with a controlled response. And instead of continuing that pattern, you pause. You allow the feeling to exist just a little longer, without trying to change it, without trying to understand it, without trying to fix it, just letting it be there. This is not dramatic, it is very subtle, but it changes everything, because the moment you stop interrupting your emotions, they begin to move again, they begin to complete themselves, and when something completes, it does not stay, it passes, naturally, without force, without effort. And with each completion, something lightens, a small release, a small return of energy. Not because you did something, but because you stopped doing something, you stopped holding, you stopped suppressing, you stopped controlling. And in that stopping, there is space. Space for movement, space for flow, space for your system to return to its natural rhythm. This does not mean you will never feel difficult emotions again. You will. But they will not accumulate in the same way. They will not stay. They will not build into something heavy and undefined, because you are no longer interrupting their process. You are allowing them to come and go. And this is where real healing begins, not in eliminating emotions, but in changing your relationship with them, from resistance to allowance, from control to observation, from suppression to completion. And as this shift deepens, you begin to notice something you may not have felt in a long time: lightness, not because life has changed, but because you are no longer carrying what does not need to be carried. Because the truth is, emotional exhaustion is not only about what you experience, it is about what you hold on to after the experience is over. And when you stop holding, you stop draining. And when you stop draining, energy begins to return, quietly, naturally, without force. And in that return, you begin to feel like yourself again, not the controlled version, not the managed version, but the one that feels and lets go, the one that experiences and moves on, the one that does not need to hide from what is real. And that is where true recovery begins. And as that lightness begins to return, something deeper starts to surface. Because once you stop suppressing what you feel, you begin to notice why you were suppressing it in the first place. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. There was a belief behind it, a quiet rule you've been following for years, maybe even your entire life. A rule that sounded like strength, but slowly became a burden. And if you look closely, it has shaped the way you relate to yourself more than anything else. Let's go deeper. There is a sentence that has lived in your mind for a very long time. It doesn't always speak loudly, but it controls a lot of your actions. I must be strong. It sounds powerful. It sounds admirable. It sounds like something to be proud of. But there is something hidden inside it, something that quietly demands that you do not feel too much. Because in the version of strength you were taught, emotions were seen as weakness. Tears were something to hide. Fear was something to overcome. Sadness was something to push through. And vulnerability was something to avoid. So you built an identity around this idea. You became the one who holds it together, the one who doesn't break, the one others can rely on. And over time, this identity became automatic. You didn't choose it anymore. You just lived it, even when it was costing you. Because identity is powerful. Once you believe this is who I am, you begin to protect that image, even if it hurts you. So when you feel something intense, you don't ask, what am I feeling? You ask, how do I stay strong right now? And in that question, the emotion is already being pushed away. Not because you don't feel it, but because you think you shouldn't. This is the illusion. Strength was never supposed to mean suppression, but somewhere along the way, it became that. And now, every time something difficult arises, you tighten, you hold it in, you try to stay composed, you try to act like it doesn't affect you. And on the outside, it looks like control, but on the inside, it creates pressure. Because strength that is built on resistance is not stable, it is fragile. It requires constant effort, constant monitoring, constant suppression. And that is exhausting. Buddhist teachings do not define strength this way. They do not see strength as the absence of emotion. They see strength as the ability to remain present with whatever arises, not to control it, not to suppress it, but to allow it, without being overwhelmed by it. There is a big difference. One version of strength says, do not feel. The other says, feel without losing yourself. The first one creates tension. The second one creates freedom. But most people were never taught the second, so they continue carrying the first. Even when it no longer works, even when it drains them, even when it disconnects them from themselves. Because letting go of that identity feels dangerous. If I'm not the strong one, then who am I? If I allow myself to feel, will I lose control? If I stop holding everything together, What happens next? These questions create fear, and that fear keeps the pattern alive, so you continue, you keep showing up, you keep pushing through, you keep acting like you're okay, even when you're not. And slowly, that gap grows between who you appear to be and what you actually feel, and maintaining that gap takes energy, a lot of it, because you are constantly managing yourself, adjusting your reactions, filtering your expressions, keeping everything within a controlled range. And over time, that becomes heavy. Not because life is too much, but because you are carrying an identity that does not allow you to rest. This is where the shift begins, not by rejecting strength, but by redefining it. Seeing that true strength is not about how much you can hold in, it is about how honestly you can relate to what you feel. It is about being able to sit with discomfort without needing to escape it, to experience sadness without turning it into weakness, to feel fear without needing to hide it, to acknowledge pain without judging yourself for it. This is a different kind of strength. It is quieter, less visible, but far more stable, because it does not depend on suppression. It depends on awareness. And awareness does not drain energy. It creates space. Space for emotions to move, space for experience to unfold, space for you to be real without needing to maintain an image. And when that space opens, something begins to soften. The constant effort to hold it together starts to fade. The pressure to be a certain version of yourself begins to loosen. And in that loosening, there is relief. Not because everything is fixed, but because you are no longer fighting yourself. This does not mean you become passive. It does not mean you collapse under every emotion. It means you stop pretending that strength requires you to be unaffected. You allow yourself to be human, fully, without editing, without controlling every reaction, without needing to meet an internal standard of toughness. Because the truth is, the idea of "I must be strong" was never yours to begin with. It was learned from culture, from family, from experiences where showing emotion was not safe, from moments where being strong was the only way to survive. And at that time, it helped you, it protected you, it allowed you to move forward. But what once protected you can later limit you. And this is where awareness becomes important. Seeing that the identity you built is not who you are. It is something you adopted, something you carried, something that can now be released. Not completely, not all at once, but gradually, by noticing when it appears. When you feel something and immediately try to contain it. When you want to express something but stop yourself. When you feel overwhelmed but tell yourself to be strong. In those moments, instead of following the pattern, you pause, you allow a little more space. You let the emotion exist without immediately controlling it, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it feels unfamiliar, because that discomfort is not weakness. It is the absence of the old pattern. And in that absence, something new can form, a different relationship with yourself. One that is not based on performance, but on presence. One that does not require you to hide parts of your experience, but allows you to include them. And slowly, you begin to feel less divided, less split between what you feel and what you show. Less pressure to maintain a certain image. More ease in simply being. And with that ease, energy returns, not in bursts, not dramatically, but steadily, because you are no longer spending it on suppression. You are no longer exhausting yourself, trying to be someone you think you need to be. You are simply allowing yourself to be. And that is where real strength exists, not in control, not in resistance, but in the ability to remain open without collapsing, to feel without being consumed, to experience without needing to hide. This is the strength that does not drain you. This is the strength that supports you. And as you begin to live from this place, you may notice something surprising. You are still strong, but not in the way you used to be. You are strong because you are honest, because you are present, because you are no longer afraid of what you feel. And that kind of strength does not exhaust you, it restores you. And in that restoration, you begin to understand something clearly, that the version of strength you were holding on to was never meant to last forever. And letting it go is not losing yourself, it is finally returning to yourself. And from here, everything begins to feel different. Not because life has changed, but because you are no longer carrying the weight of pretending. And that alone changes everything. And when you begin to let go of the identity that says you must always be strong, another truth begins to appear underneath it. Because exhaustion is not only created by what you suppress, it is also created by what you keep reaching for. There is a quiet hunger in the mind that rarely rests. It keeps saying, just one more thing, just one more answer, just one more sign that everything will be okay. And for a long time, that hunger can look like ambition, love, hope, discipline, or even healing. But beneath all those names, there is often something much older at work, a grasping, a pulling, a restless need that never quite lets you settle. And this is where a deeper layer of emotional exhaustion begins. There is a hidden force in the mind that can drain more energy than hard work, more energy than sadness, and sometimes even more energy than pain itself. In Buddhism, this force is called tanha. Tanha is often translated as craving, but craving is not just wanting something in a normal way. It is not simply preference. It is not the gentle wish for something beautiful or meaningful. Tanha is the inner pressure that says, I need this to be different. I need this to happen. I need this person to act a certain way. I need this feeling to go away. I need peace now. I need healing now. I need certainty now. That pressure may look invisible from the outside, but inside it creates enormous strain. This is why a person can be lying still in bed and still feel exhausted. The body may be resting, but the mind is pulling toward what it wants, pulling away from what it fears, pulling against what it cannot accept, pulling toward a future where everything is finally settled, pulling toward a version of life where nothing hurts anymore, and this constant pulling is tiring. Not because wanting is wrong, but because craving turns life into a struggle against the present moment. This is where what can be called tanha burnout begins. It is the exhaustion that comes from needing too much from every moment, the depletion that comes from mentally leaning forward all the time, the fatigue of never allowing anything to simply be what it is. At first, this can be hard to see because craving often disguises itself as something noble. It says, I just want clarity. It says, I just want closure. It says, I just want to feel better. It says, I just want them to understand me. And none of those things sound harmful. In fact, they sound reasonable. But the hidden question is this: what happens inside you when those things do not come? If your whole system tightens, if your peace disappears, if your mind begins racing, if your body starts carrying pressure, then the issue is not the desire itself. The issue is the attachment behind it. The mind has quietly made a contract with reality. It has said, I can be okay, but only if this happens. I can relax, but only if I get this answer. I can rest, but only if this pain ends quickly. I can breathe, but only if life becomes easier. And because reality rarely obeys these private contracts, the mind stays in conflict. That conflict is draining. This is one of the deepest insights in Buddhism. Human suffering is not caused only by pain. It is intensified by craving. Pain may arise naturally in life, but craving turns pain into ongoing exhaustion because it refuses to let the moment be incomplete. When the mind is craving, it cannot truly rest. Even pleasant moments become unstable because the mind fears losing them. Even healing becomes stressful because the mind wants results. Even love becomes tiring because the mind clings. Even hope becomes heavy because the mind turns it into demand. This is why some people feel exhausted even while chasing good things. They are not only moving towards something, they are gripping it inwardly, and gripping consumes energy. Think about how often the mind says, "When this is over, I'll finally feel calm." When they reply, "I'll finally relax." When I understand why this happened, I'll finally be at peace. When my emotions settle down, I'll finally feel like myself again. That word finally carries a lot of weight. It places peace somewhere else, somewhere later, somewhere conditional, and the nervous system feels that. It learns that this moment is not enough, that now is not safe, that now is not acceptable, that now must be escaped, improved, completed, explained, or replaced. So the mind keeps moving. This movement may be invisible, but it never stops. It moves through replaying conversations. It moves through planning outcomes. It moves through checking emotional states. It moves through searching for reassurance. It moves through comparing the present to an imagined future where everything feels lighter. And little by little, the person becomes worn out. This is not simply stress, it is the fatigue of continual craving. The Buddha spoke very clearly about this. Craving is one of the central roots of suffering because it binds the mind to constant dissatisfaction. No matter what is present, something feels missing. No matter what has been achieved, something feels unresolved. No matter how much effort has been given, the mind still says, "Not enough." This can show up in obvious ways, like craving success, affection, approval, or control, but it also shows up in very subtle ways. You can crave peace. You can crave healing. You can crave emotional certainty. You can crave an explanation for why you feel the way you feel. You can crave a version of yourself that never gets tired. And when those things become demands rather than gentle preferences, they start to exhaust you. This is why recovery from emotional exhaustion cannot be only about getting more energy. It must also involve seeing where energy is being burned. And craving burns a lot. It burns through attention because it keeps the mind fixated. It burns through emotion because it creates tension. It burns through the body because it keeps the nervous system slightly braced. It burns through time because it keeps you living in almost, not yet, still waiting. One of the saddest things about tanha burnout is that the person often blames themselves for being tired without realizing that their tiredness is coming from a war they never stop fighting inside. A war with uncertainty, a war with imperfection, a war with delay, a war with pain, a war with reality itself. And no one can stay in that war without becoming exhausted. This does not mean you must stop caring. Buddhism does not ask you to become numb or detached in a cold way. It asks something much more subtle. It asks you to see the difference between caring and clinging. Caring is open, clinging is tight. Caring allows room for life to unfold. Clinging demands that life obey your fear. Caring says, "This matters to me." Clinging says, "I cannot be okay without this." That last sentence is where burnout grows, because the moment your inner balance depends on something outside your control, your energy becomes unstable. And there is so much that is outside your control: other people's timing, other people's feelings, the pace of healing, the return of motivation, the body's recovery, the mind's ability to quiet down. If you cling to controlling these things, you create friction against life. That friction is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just a background hum of restlessness. But even background tension drains vitality over time. This is why so many people feel tired even when nothing clearly terrible is happening. The exhaustion is not always coming from events. It is coming from the internal demand that events must resolve in a certain way. Once you start seeing this, your whole understanding of exhaustion begins to change. You realize that some of your tiredness is not from doing too much. It is from wanting too tightly, wanting the conversation to go differently, wanting the person to change, wanting the memory to stop hurting, wanting your mind to be quiet immediately, wanting your path to make perfect sense, wanting your emotions to move on your schedule, wanting life to match the picture in your head. There is nothing shameful in this. It is deeply human, but it is still exhausting. And if it is not seen clearly, it becomes a permanent engine running beneath everything. It pushes you even when you are trying to rest. It keeps your heart leaning forward even when your body is still. It makes simple moments feel incomplete because the mind is always asking, what next? What now? How long? When will this end? When will I feel better? When will I arrive? This is why one of the greatest forms of healing is not getting everything you want. It is loosening the inner grip that says you need it in order to breathe. That loosening is how tanha begins to dissolve. Not through force, not through pretending you do not care, not through scolding yourself for craving, but through awareness, gentle, honest, repeated awareness. You begin by noticing craving as sensation, not just thought. You feel the leaning in the chest, the tension in the jaw, the tightening in the stomach, the mental urgency, the impulse to check, solve, fix, reach, secure. This is important because craving is not only an idea, it is a body state. It lives as contraction. The moment you notice contraction, you have already stepped out of total unconsciousness. You are no longer completely inside the craving. You are seeing it, and seeing changes everything, because what is seen can soften. Then comes a deeper step. You stop feeding the craving with stories. Instead of endlessly repeating, I need this to happen, you begin to ask, what is this craving promising me? Usually, beneath craving, there is a promise. If I get this, I will be safe. If I solve this, I will be at peace. If they understand me, I will finally relax. If I heal faster, I will become lovable again. If I know the outcome, I can rest. Craving always speaks the language of rescue. It tells you that one more thing will save you from uncertainty, discomfort, or incompleteness. But the problem is that even when one craving is satisfied, the mind often finds another. Not because the mind is evil, but because a craving-based mind does not know how to settle. It only knows how to move toward relief. This is why dissolving tanha is not about completing every desire. It is about no longer believing that relief lives at the end of getting what you want. Relief begins to appear the moment you stop demanding that the present becomes something else. This is difficult at first because the craving mind fears that letting go means giving up. It fears passivity. It fears losing direction. It fears that without pressure, nothing good will happen. But this is not true. You can still act. You can still care. You can still choose, work, love, build, and heal. The difference is that your peace is no longer chained to the result. This is the heart of the Buddhist path, to move through life without being owned by grasping, to participate fully without inner imprisonment, to love without clinging, to hope without demanding, to heal without turning healing into another battlefield. When this begins to sink in, the nervous system starts to unlearn urgency. You stop treating every discomfort like an emergency. You stop treating every unanswered question like a threat. You stop treating every delay like failure. And suddenly, energy that was tied up in inner pulling becomes available again. This return of energy can feel almost strange, not dramatic, but spacious. You notice small moments of ease, a conversation that does not stay in your head for hours, a difficult feeling that passes without turning into a long spiral. A pause where you do not need to chase the next solution. A little less grasping, a little more breathing. That is healing. Not because life has become simple, but because you are no longer turning every unfinished thing into a personal emergency. There is also a deeper kind of wisdom here. Craving is often strongest where there is fear. You do not cling tightly where you feel deeply safe. You cling where something inside you is afraid of loss, insignificance, rejection, pain, uncertainty, or emptiness. So when craving appears, it is helpful not to condemn it, but to listen beneath it. What am I afraid would happen if I did not get this? What am I hoping this outcome will protect me from? What part of me feels unsafe in this moment? These questions move you beneath the surface. They reveal that craving is often the mind's attempt to create control where there is vulnerability. And once vulnerability is seen with kindness, the craving loses some of its force. Because now you are not obeying it blindly, you are understanding it. This is one of the most compassionate aspects of Buddhist healing. It does not ask you to become hard on yourself. It asks you to become clear enough to see the difference between need and attachment. Clear enough to notice when desire has turned into struggle. Clear enough to understand that the mind's insistence is often what deepens suffering. As this clarity grows, you begin practicing something very simple and very powerful. You let the moment be incomplete. You let uncertainty remain unanswered for a while. You let healing be unfinished. You let emotions move at their own pace. You let people be what they are, instead of mentally forcing them into what would make you comfortable. You let your own inner state be imperfect without immediately turning it into a project. This kind of allowing is not weakness. It is the end of unnecessary struggle. And struggle is what has been costing you so much energy. A person trapped in tanha burnout is like someone who never stops clenching their fist. Even when there is nothing in the hand, the clenching continues. The muscles ache, the arm becomes tired, and eventually the whole body feels the strain. Opening the hand does not solve every problem in life, but it ends the strain of unnecessary gripping. That is what dissolving craving feels like. Not the loss of all preference, not the death of all desire, but the release of inner clenching. And with that release, there is more room for life to move. You become less driven by urgency and more guided by wisdom, less controlled by fear and more rooted in presence, less exhausted by outcomes and more available to the reality of now. This does not happen once and forever. Craving returns in many forms. It may show up in love, healing, work, identity, or even spirituality. The mind may start craving enlightenment, craving peace, craving the perfect inner state. That is why awareness must remain gentle and ongoing. Each time you notice the inner pull, you do not need to panic. You simply recognize it. Ah, the mind is grasping again. Ah, there is pressure again. Ah, there is the old belief that peace is somewhere else. And with that recognition, you soften the body. You loosen the jaw. You breathe into the chest. You stop feeding the thought. You return to what is here. Little by little, this becomes a way of living. A life where desire is lighter. A life where care does not become captivity. A life where emotional energy is no longer leaking through constant grasping. And this matters deeply for exhaustion, because so much emotional depletion comes from fighting the present with hidden demands. When those hidden demands are seen and softened, the mind stops running so hard. And when the mind stops running so hard, the body finally gets a chance to recover. This is the gift hidden inside the teaching of tanha. It shows you that some tiredness does not come from life being too much. It comes from the mind refusing to stop pulling against life. Once that pulling eases, even a hard season can feel more breathable. Even pain can be met with more softness. Even uncertainty can exist without destroying your peace. And from there, something precious begins to return. Not excitement, not intensity, but steadiness. A quiet, grounded steadiness that does not need everything to be resolved before it can exist. That steadiness is one of the deepest forms of healing. Because emotional exhaustion is not only healed by rest, it is healed by the end of inner struggle, and craving, when unseen, is struggle. But when seen clearly, it can loosen, and when it loosens, you discover that you do not need to force peace into your life. Peace was being crowded out by grasping. As the grasping softens, peace has space to reappear, not as a reward, not as something you achieve, but as what remains when the mind finally stops saying, "This moment is not enough." And in that quiet enoughness, energy begins to gather again, slowly, naturally, without being chased, without being demanded, without being squeezed out of life. It returns because the hidden engine of exhaustion is no longer burning so hot. And for the first time in a long time, you are not leaning toward the next thing that will supposedly save you. You are here, breathing, feeling. Not complete, but not at war. Still healing, but no longer driven by panic. Still human, but less imprisoned by craving. And that is where recovery becomes real. Not when everything is finally perfect, but when the mind no longer needs perfection in order to rest. And as that inner grasping begins to soften, as the mind slowly stops pulling so tightly against life, something else becomes visible. Because even when craving quiets down, there can still be a weight that remains. A different kind of pressure. Not coming from what you want, but from who you believe you have to be. There is a role you have been carrying, quietly, consistently, without question. And the strange part is, no one may have ever forced it onto you, but somehow it became yours. Let's go deeper. There is a kind of burden that does not come from tasks, responsibilities, or even difficult situations. It comes from identity, from the roles you have slowly built around yourself. Over time, the helper, the fixer, the strong one, the reliable one, the one who always understands, the one who never needs anything. At first, these roles feel meaningful. They give you a sense of purpose. They make you feel needed, respected, valuable. People begin to depend on you. They come to you for advice, for support, for stability, and you respond. You show up, you give, you carry, and over time, something shifts. What started as a choice becomes an expectation, not just from others, but from yourself. You no longer ask, "Can I handle this right now?" You ask, "How do I make sure I don't fail this role?" And that question changes everything. Because now, you are no longer acting from presence, you are acting from identity. And identity does not rest. It demands consistency, it demands performance, it demands that you remain the same, even when your internal state is changing. So even when you are tired, you still help. Even when you are overwhelmed, you still fix. Even when you need support, you still stay strong. Because that is who you believe you are. And slowly, that belief becomes heavy. Not because helping is wrong, not because being strong is bad, but because you are doing it without space, without choice, without checking if you have the energy to give. This is where the unseen collapse begins. Not in one dramatic moment, but in small, repeated acts of self-neglect. Moments where you ignore your own limits, moments where you silence your own needs, moments where you carry something. Not because you can, but because you feel you must, and each of those moments takes something from you. A little bit of energy, a little bit of clarity, a little bit of emotional space, until one day you feel empty. Not because life is too much, but because you have been giving from a place that never refills. This is the weight of invisible roles. They are invisible because no one sees the pressure behind them. From the outside, You look capable. You look dependable. You look like you have everything under control. But inside, you are tired. Not just physically, but deeply, because you are constantly managing the gap between how you feel and how you believe you must show up. And maintaining that gap is exhausting. Buddhist teachings point to something very important here. They remind you that identity is not fixed. It is not who you are. It is something you create, and then forget that you created it. You begin to treat it as truth, as something that cannot change, but it can. And more importantly, it should. Because life is not static. Your energy changes, your capacity changes, your emotional state changes. But when you are attached to a role, you try to remain constant. And that creates friction. You are forcing yourself to stay the same in a system that is always moving. And that friction drains you. Think about how often you say yes when something inside you wants to say no. Not because you don't see the cost, but because the role says you should. Think about how often you listen, support, advise, hold space for others while no one is holding space for you. Not because people don't care, but because you have trained them to see you as the one who doesn't need anything. And over time, that becomes your reality. You become surrounded by people, but emotionally alone, because you are always the giver, never the receiver, always the one who understands, never the one who is allowed to be confused, always the one who stays calm, never the one who breaks. And this imbalance slowly wears you down, not in obvious ways, but in quiet ways. You lose the ability to check in with yourself. You lose the habit of asking what you need. You lose the permission to step back without guilt. Because stepping back feels like failure. It feels like you are no longer being who you are supposed to be. And that fear keeps you locked in the role, even when it is costing you your energy, even when it is draining your emotional life, even when it is disconnecting you from yourself. This is where awareness becomes essential. Not to judge yourself, but to see clearly. To notice the moments where you are acting from identity instead of presence. To recognize when you are giving, not because it feels right, but because it feels required. To feel the difference between genuine willingness and internal pressure, because they are not the same. One is light, the other is heavy. One comes with openness, the other comes with tension, and your body knows the difference. You can feel it, a slight resistance, a subtle tightness, a quiet sense of, I don't actually want to do this, but I feel like I have to. That feeling is important. It is not something to ignore. It is a signal that the role is taking over. And when the role takes over, you lose touch with choice. You stop acting freely. You start acting automatically. And automatic patterns are what keep exhaustion in place, because they do not adapt. They repeat. No matter how you feel, no matter how tired you are, no matter how much you need space, they keep going until something breaks. And that breaking point often feels sudden, but it has been building for a long time. Through every moment you ignored your own limits. Through every time you chose the role over your own well-being. Through every situation where you carried more than you could hold. So what is the way out? It is not about abandoning who you are. It is not about becoming selfish or distant. It is about loosening the grip of identity, allowing yourself to be more than just one version of yourself, allowing yourself to shift, to have days where you are not the strong one, to have moments where you are not the helper, to have space where you are not responsible for everything. This does not make you less. It makes you real, because no one can exist in one role all the time without becoming exhausted. Life requires flexibility, and flexibility requires letting go of fixed identities. This begins with small changes, very small. You start noticing when you are about to say yes automatically, And you pause. You give yourself a moment. You check in. Do I have the energy for this? Do I want to do this? Or do I feel obligated? And sometimes the answer will be uncomfortable, because you will realize that you have been acting out of obligation more than you thought. But that realization is not a problem. It is clarity, and clarity gives you choice. You may still choose to help, but now it is a conscious choice, not a forced one. And that changes how it feels, because when you choose freely, there is less resistance, and less resistance means less exhaustion. You also begin to allow yourself to receive, not in a dramatic way, but in simple ways. Letting someone listen to you without turning the conversation back to them. Letting someone support you without minimizing your need. Letting yourself be seen, not as the strong one, but as a human being. This can feel uncomfortable at first because it breaks the pattern, but it also restores balance. And balance is where energy returns, because giving and receiving are meant to flow together, not exist in one direction. When you only give, you deplete. When you allow yourself to receive, you replenish. And over time, this begins to shift your entire experience. You feel less pressure, less responsibility to hold everything together, less need to maintain an image, more space to simply be. And in that space, something important happens. You reconnect with yourself, not the role, not the identity, but the part of you that exists beneath all of that, the part that feels, the part that knows, the part that can sense when something is too much, and when something is right. And when you reconnect with that, you stop living from expectation. You start living from awareness, and awareness does not exhaust you. It guides you gently, clearly, without force. So the next time you feel tired, look beyond what you are doing. Look at who you are trying to be and ask yourself, is this something I am choosing or something I feel I must maintain? Because sometimes the exhaustion is not coming from life. It is coming from the weight of a role you no longer need to carry. And the moment you begin to loosen that weight, even slightly, you will feel it. A small shift, a little more space, a little more breath, a little more energy returning. Not because everything is fixed, but because you are no longer holding yourself in a shape that does not allow you to rest. And from that place, healing continues, quietly, naturally, without force. Because for the first time in a long time, you are not just surviving your roles, you are stepping outside of them. And in that step, you begin to feel free again. And as that sense of freedom begins to open, as the weight of roles starts to loosen, another pattern quietly reveals itself. Because even when you stop carrying identities, even when you begin to listen to your limits, there is still something that keeps pulling you back into exhaustion. A reflex, a habit so automatic you rarely question it. The moment something painful appears, you try to change it, to fix it, to explain it, to escape it, and without realizing it, that reaction is where much of your energy disappears. There is a different way of meeting pain, a way that feels unfamiliar at first, but slowly restores what has been lost. Let's go deeper. There is a simple truth that is difficult to accept. Pain is not what exhausts you the most. It is your resistance to pain. The moment discomfort appears in the body or mind, something inside you tightens, a quiet reaction. This shouldn't be here. And from that moment, the struggle begins. You start searching for a way out. You try to distract yourself. You try to think your way through it. You try to replace it with something better. You try to speed up the process so it ends quickly. And all of that effort, all of that movement consumes energy. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are interfering with something that was already designed to pass. In Buddhist understanding, emotions are not permanent states. They are events. They arise, they stay for a while, and they dissolve. but only when they are allowed to follow their natural course. The moment you interfere, the process changes. Instead of moving through you, the emotion gets stuck, not because it wants to stay, but because you are holding it in place. This is what non-interference means. It does not mean you like the pain. It does not mean you accept it in a passive way. It means you stop trying to control its existence. You stop arguing with it. You stop demanding that it leave immediately. You allow it to be present, without turning it into a problem to solve. This is very different from how most people have learned to relate to pain. From a young age, you are taught to fix discomfort quickly. If something hurts, do something about it. If something feels wrong, change it. If something is unpleasant, avoid it. And this works well for physical situations. But emotional experience does not follow the same rules, because emotions are not problems, they are processes, and processes cannot be rushed without consequence. When you interfere with pain, you extend it. When you allow pain, you shorten it. This sounds strange at first, because the mind believes that doing something is always better than doing nothing. But in this case, doing less creates more space. And that space is what allows the emotion to complete itself. Think about what happens when you feel something uncomfortable, a wave of sadness, a surge of anxiety, a tightness in your chest. The sensation appears, and almost immediately the mind reacts. Why do I feel this? What is causing this? How do I make this go away? Is this normal? Will this last forever? These questions are not harmless. They create movement, and that movement interrupts the natural flow of the emotion. Instead of feeling the sensation directly, you move into thinking about it, analyzing it, judging it, trying to change it. And in doing that, you move away from the experience itself. But the emotion is still there. Now it is combined with mental activity. And that combination makes it feel stronger, heavier, more overwhelming. This is why sometimes the more you try to understand a feeling, the more intense it becomes, because you are feeding it attention without allowing it to move. Non-interference is the opposite of that. It is the ability to stay with the raw experience without adding anything to it. No story, no analysis, no immediate reaction, just feeling. This does not mean you sit still and suffer. It means you shift your relationship with the sensation. Instead of seeing it as something to escape, you see it as something to observe. You notice where it is in the body. You feel its texture, its intensity, its movement, without trying to change it, without trying to make it better. This may feel uncomfortable at first, because you are not used to staying with discomfort. You are used to moving away from it. But if you stay, even for a few moments, something begins to change. The sensation starts to shift, not because you forced it, but because it is no longer being held in place. It moves, it softens, it transforms, and eventually, it passes. This is something you can experience directly. A feeling arises. You do nothing to interfere. You simply allow it. And after some time, it fades. This is the natural intelligence of the mind. It knows how to process emotions. It knows how to release them. But only when you stop interrupting the process. This is where a lot of energy is restored, because instead of fighting every feeling, you begin to trust the movement of experience. You stop seeing emotions as threats. You stop reacting to every discomfort. You stop turning every feeling into a task. And in that stopping, there is rest. Not the rest of sleep, but the rest of not having to constantly manage your internal state. This is a deeper kind of relaxation, one that comes from allowing rather than controlling. It also changes how you relate to difficult moments. Instead of saying, I need to get out of this feeling, you begin to say, this is here right now. And that shift removes pressure. because you are no longer trying to be somewhere else. You are simply acknowledging where you are. And acknowledgement is lighter than resistance. Resistance creates tension. Acknowledgement creates space, and space allows movement. This does not mean you will never feel discomfort again. It means discomfort will no longer trap you in the same way, because you are no longer adding layers to it. You are not turning it into a problem. You are not turning it into a story. You are letting it be what it is, a temporary experience. This is where emotional resilience begins to form, not from avoiding pain, but from learning that you can stay with it without losing yourself. That you can feel something intense and still be present. That you can experience discomfort without needing to escape. And over time, this builds a quiet confidence, not the loud confidence of control, but the steady confidence of trust. Trust in your ability to experience without being overwhelmed. Trust in the natural movement of emotions. Trust that not everything needs to be fixed. And this trust reduces exhaustion, because you are no longer spending energy trying to control the uncontrollable. You are allowing life to unfold without constant interference. There is also something important to understand here. Non-interference does not mean you ignore your needs. It does not mean you stay in harmful situations. It is not about passivity. It is about how you relate to the internal experience, not the external situation. You can still take action. You can still make changes. You can still move away from what is not healthy. But internally, you are not fighting the feeling itself. You are allowing it to exist while you decide what to do. This creates clarity, because when you are not reacting to the emotion, you can see more clearly. You can respond instead of react. You can choose instead of being driven. And choice is where freedom lives. Without non-interference, your actions are often reactions, quick, urgent, driven by discomfort. With non-interference, your actions come from awareness, calm, intentional, grounded. This difference is subtle but powerful. It changes how you move through life. Because you are no longer controlled by every wave of feeling, you are riding the wave without trying to stop the ocean. And that is what reduces emotional exhaustion. Not the absence of waves, but the end of the struggle against them. The more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. At first, it may feel like you are doing nothing, but over time, you realize that doing nothing is actually a deep form of engagement. You are fully present, fully aware, fully allowing, and that presence is what transforms the experience. Because when you are fully with something, it does not need to stay. It completes itself, and completion is what brings release. So the next time you feel something uncomfortable, notice the impulse to fix it, to escape it, to understand it immediately. And instead of following that impulse, pause, stay, feel, let the sensation exist without interference, even if it's just for a few seconds, and then watch what happens. Not with expectation, but with curiosity, because in that small moment of non-interference, you may notice something you have not felt in a long time. A sense of ease, a softening, a quiet release, and in that release, a little bit of your energy returns. Not because the feeling disappeared instantly, but because you stopped fighting it. And that is the beginning of a different way of living, a way where emotions are not enemies, a way where pain is not something to escape, a way where your energy is not constantly drained by resistance, because you are no longer interfering with what needs to pass. You are allowing it. And in that allowing, you begin to feel lighter, not because life is easier, but because you are no longer making it harder than it needs to be. And from that place, healing continues quietly, naturally, without force, because for the first time, you are not trying to control your experience. You are letting it move. And that movement is what brings you back to yourself. And as you begin to stop interfering with pain, as you learn to let emotions move without trying to fix them, something else becomes easier to notice. Because even when the body is still, even when nothing is happening around you, the mind can still be working. Quietly, constantly, repeating a conversation from earlier. A moment that didn't go the way you wanted. A sentence you wish you had said differently. A situation that hasn't even happened yet, but already feels real. And without realizing it, you begin to live inside those moments again and again, not in the present, but in rehearsal. Let's go deeper. There is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from what you do, but from what you replay. You may be sitting alone, doing nothing, and still feel drained. Because the mind is not resting, it is revisiting, reconstructing, rewriting, trying to solve something that already happened or hasn't happened yet. This is mental rehearsal. It feels like thinking, it feels like processing, it feels like preparation. But most of the time, it is repetition without resolution. You go over the same conversation again, what you said, what they meant, what you should have said, what they might say next time. And each time you replay it, it feels slightly different. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Sometimes you explain yourself perfectly. Sometimes you defend yourself better. Sometimes you imagine a version of the moment where everything makes sense. But none of those versions are real. They exist only in the mind. And yet, your body responds as if they are happening. This is where energy begins to leak, because the nervous system cannot fully distinguish between real experience and vividly imagined experience. When you replay something emotionally charged, your body reacts, your heart rate changes, your muscles tighten, your breathing shifts, your emotional state activates again. And each activation costs energy. Now think about how many times you replay the same moment. 5 times, 10 times, 50 times. Each time, the body responds. Each time, energy is used, and nothing is resolved because the moment is over, or it hasn't even happened yet. This is what makes mental rehearsal so draining. It creates activity without completion, movement without progress, engagement without release. And over time, that becomes exhausting. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady depletion. You feel tired without understanding why. You feel heavy without doing anything physical. You feel mentally crowded, even in silence, because your mind is not in the present, it is looping. This looping often begins with a simple intention. You want to understand, you want to prepare, you want to get it right next time. You want to avoid making the same mistake. And those intentions are not wrong. But the way the mind goes about it becomes excessive. It does not think once. It thinks repeatedly. It does not reflect briefly. It circles endlessly. It does not prepare. It over-prepares. And in doing so, it loses balance. Buddhist teachings point to something important here. The mind has a tendency to cling to unfinished experiences, moments that feel incomplete, unclear, emotionally charged. And when something feels unfinished, the mind tries to close the loop. It tries to resolve it through thinking. But thinking cannot always resolve emotional experience, because emotion does not follow logic. You cannot think your way out of something that needs to be felt, or accepted, or simply allowed to pass. So the mind keeps trying. It replays, it analyzes, it reconstructs, hoping that one more pass will bring closure. But instead of closing the loop, it strengthens it. Each repetition makes the pattern more familiar, more automatic, more accessible, until it becomes a habit, a default response. Anytime something slightly uncomfortable happens, the mind goes back. It starts rehearsing. And you may not even notice it at first. It feels normal. It feels like something you've always done, but the cost is there. in your energy, in your attention, in your ability to rest. Because true rest is not just the absence of physical activity. It is the absence of mental looping. And when the mind is rehearsing, it is not resting. Even if you are lying down, even if your eyes are closed, even if everything around you is quiet. Inside there is movement, and that movement keeps the system active. This is why sometimes you can lie in bed for hours and still wake up tired, because your body was still, but your mind was not. It was busy replaying, rehearsing, trying to fix something that cannot be fixed in thought. This becomes even more intense when the rehearsal involves emotion, because now it is not just thinking, it is feeling. You relive the frustration, the embarrassment, the disappointment, the confusion, and each time you relive it, it feels real again, as if it is happening now. So instead of the emotion passing, it is renewed again and again, and this renewal is what keeps it alive. Not the original event, but the repeated engagement with it. This is where the shift begins, not by trying to stop thinking completely. That is not realistic. The mind thinks. That is its nature. But there is a difference between thinking once and thinking repeatedly, between reflecting and rehearsing, between observing and looping. The first step is awareness, noticing when the mind goes back, noticing the moment the replay begins. It often starts subtly. A memory appears, a sentence forms, a scenario begins, and before you know it, you are inside it, replaying, adjusting, responding. But now, instead of continuing automatically, you pause, you notice. The mind is rehearsing. This recognition is important because it creates distance. You are no longer completely inside the loop. You are seeing it, and what is seen can be softened. The next step is not to fight the thought. Fighting creates more tension, more resistance, more energy loss. Instead, you allow the thought to be there, without following it, without building on it, without adding more detail. You let it exist, like a sound in the background. And then you gently return your attention to what is present, your breath, your body, the space around you, not in a forced way, but in a quiet, steady way. This is not about pushing the thought away. It is about not feeding it, because thoughts gain strength through attention. The more you engage, the more they grow. The less you engage, the more they fade. Over time, this changes the pattern. The mind still produces thoughts, but they no longer pull you in as strongly. They pass instead of looping. This reduces the energy leak, because you are no longer reactivating the same experience repeatedly. You are allowing it to move through once, and then letting it go. There is also something important to understand about closure. The mind often replays situations because it believes something is missing. An answer, an explanation, a different outcome. But not all experiences can be resolved in the way the mind wants. Some conversations will remain unclear. Some interactions will remain imperfect. Some outcomes will not make sense. And if you keep trying to resolve them mentally, you will stay in the loop. Because the solution does not exist in thought. It exists in acceptance, in allowing the moment to remain incomplete, without needing to fix it. This is difficult because the mind prefers certainty. It prefers clear endings, but life does not always provide that. And learning to live with that uncertainty is what frees you from endless rehearsal. You begin to see that not every thought needs to be completed. Not every scenario needs to be explored. Not every conversation needs to be reworked. Some things can simply be left as they are. And in leaving them, you create space. Space in the mind, space in the body, space in your energy, because you are no longer carrying the weight of constant mental activity. This also changes how you relate to future scenarios. The mind often rehearses not just the past, but the future. What if this happens? What if that goes wrong? What if I say the wrong thing? What if they react this way? And again, the intention is protection. You are trying to prepare. But excessive rehearsal does not create clarity. It creates tension, because you are living through possibilities, as if they are real, and your body responds accordingly. So instead of preparing, you are exhausting yourself before anything even happens. The shift here is similar. You notice the rehearsal. You allow the thought to exist, but you do not follow it. You return to the present, because the present is the only place where your energy is actually needed. The future will come when it comes, and when it does, you will respond, not from rehearsed perfection, but from presence, and presence is more adaptable than any mental script, because it is alive, flexible, responsive. It meets what is actually happening, not what was imagined. As this practice deepens, you begin to experience something different. Silence, not forced silence, but natural quiet. Moments where the mind is not replaying anything. Moments where you are simply here, breathing, sensing, existing. And in those moments, energy gathers. Because nothing is being drained, nothing is being reactivated, nothing is being carried forward unnecessarily. This is not something you achieve once. It is something you return to again and again. Each time you notice the loop, each time you step out of it, each time you choose presence over rehearsal. And slowly, the habit weakens. The loops become less frequent, less intense, less automatic, until one day, you notice that something that used to replay endlessly now passes, without holding you, without draining you. And that is a quiet form of freedom. Not from thinking, but from being trapped in thought, because the mind is no longer your constant environment. It is something that arises and passes, and you are not inside every movement. You are observing, allowing, returning. And in that returning, you reclaim your energy, not by doing more, but by repeating less. And from that place, you begin to feel lighter, clearer, more present, not because life has changed, but because you are no longer living it twice, once in reality and again in rehearsal. You are living it once, fully, and letting it go. And that is where your energy begins to come back, quietly, naturally, without force, because the leak has been reduced, and what remains is enough. Enough to breathe, enough to feel, enough to continue, without carrying the same moment over and over again. And from here, you begin to rest, not just physically, but mentally. And that kind of rest changes everything. And as the mind begins to quiet, as those constant loops lose their grip, something else becomes easier to see. Because even when the thoughts slow down, even when the replaying stops, there is still a pressure that can rise suddenly from within, a feeling that something needs to be done right now, a tension that says, fix this immediately, a voice that says, you cannot stay like this. And without realizing it, you begin to rush, not in your body, but in your mind. Let's go deeper. There is a powerful illusion that lives inside emotional experience. It is not always loud, but it is convincing. The illusion that every feeling is urgent, that every discomfort requires action, that every wave of emotion must be resolved immediately. This is what creates the false urgency of inner turmoil, a state where your mind treats temporary feelings like emergencies. You feel anxiety, and your system reacts as if something is wrong right now. You feel sadness, and your mind begins searching for a solution. You feel confusion, and you immediately try to figure everything out. It happens so quickly. You don't even question it, because it feels real. It feels important. It feels necessary. But here is the truth that begins to change everything. Not every emotional wave requires you to do something. Some emotions are not signals for action. They are signals for awareness. But when you treat every feeling as something that must be fixed, you create pressure, and that pressure drains you. Think about how often this happens. A small discomfort appears, and instantly the mind reacts. What is this? Why do I feel this? How do I get rid of this? What should I do? The questions begin, the movement begins, the urgency builds, and suddenly something small feels big, not because it grew, but because your reaction amplified it. This is how inner turmoil becomes exhausting, not from the original feeling, but from the urgency you attach to it. Because urgency activates the system. It speeds up your thoughts, it tightens your body, it narrows your attention. It creates a sense that something must be resolved now. And when that resolution does not come quickly, the pressure increases. You feel stuck, you feel overwhelmed, you feel like you are failing to manage your own mind. But the problem is not your ability to manage. It is the belief that you must act immediately. This belief turns normal emotional movement into a constant state of alert, and alertness is not restful. It consumes energy, even when nothing external is happening. Buddhist teachings offer a very different perspective. They show that emotions are like waves. They rise, they peak, they fall, but they do this on their own timeline, not on yours. And when you try to control that timeline, you create friction. You try to push the wave away before it has reached its peak. You try to calm the mind before it has finished expressing itself. You try to settle the feeling before it has completed its movement. And in doing so, you interrupt the natural process, which creates more disturbance, not less. This is why urgency is so deceptive. It feels like it will solve the problem, but it often deepens it. Because you are acting from discomfort, not from clarity. And actions taken from discomfort rarely bring peace. They bring temporary relief, followed by more tension, because the underlying pattern has not changed. Only the surface has been adjusted. This is where a deeper understanding becomes important. Emotions are not commands. They are experiences. They do not require immediate response. They require presence. This is a subtle shift, but it changes everything. Instead of reacting to every feeling, you begin to observe it. You allow it to be there, without rushing, without trying to resolve it instantly, without turning it into a task. And in that space, something begins to settle, not because you fixed it, but because you stopped pushing it. You stopped adding urgency. You stopped treating it like a problem. And when the pressure drops, the system relaxes. This relaxation is not forced. It happens naturally, because the body is no longer being told that something is wrong. It is being allowed to process at its own pace. This is what most people miss. They think calm comes from control, but calm often comes from non-interference, from not escalating the experience, from not adding urgency where it is not needed. This also changes how you relate to your thoughts, because urgency is not only emotional, it is cognitive. The mind starts to rush toward conclusions, to find answers quickly, to make decisions under pressure, to resolve uncertainty as fast as possible. But clarity does not come from speed. It comes from stillness. When you slow down, even slightly, you create space for understanding. You allow the mind to settle. You allow perception to become clearer. And from that clarity, better responses emerge, not rushed, not forced, but aligned. This is the difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is fast, driven by urgency. Response is slower, guided by awareness. And awareness is where energy is conserved. Because you are no longer constantly activating your system, you are allowing it to move without interference. This becomes especially important in difficult emotional states. When you feel overwhelmed, the instinct is to act, to change something, to escape, to find relief. But if you pause, even briefly, You may notice that the intensity shifts on its own, that what felt unbearable becomes manageable, that what felt urgent becomes less so, not because you solved it, but because you gave it space. This space is not passive, it is active awareness, a quiet presence that does not interfere, that does not rush, that does not demand immediate change. And in that presence, the system finds its balance, because it is no longer being pushed. This also helps you see something important. Not all discomfort is a signal for action. Some discomfort is simply part of being human, a temporary state, a passing experience. And when you treat it as something that must be fixed, you create unnecessary work, unnecessary stress, unnecessary exhaustion. But when you allow it, you reduce that burden. You stop carrying what does not need to be carried, and your energy stays with you. This does not mean you ignore everything. It means you become selective. You learn to distinguish between what requires action and what requires patience, between what needs to be addressed and what needs to be allowed. This distinction is not always obvious, but it becomes clearer with practice. The more you observe, the more you understand, the more you slow down, the more you see, and over time, you develop a different relationship with your inner experience, one that is not driven by urgency, but guided by awareness. And awareness is stable. It does not rush, it does not panic, it simply sees. And from seeing comes clarity. From clarity comes wise action, and from wise action comes less exhaustion, because you are no longer reacting to every wave. You are allowing the waves to rise and fall without pulling you in. This creates a sense of space, a sense of distance from the intensity, not detachment in a cold way, but in a grounded way. You are still present, still aware, but not overwhelmed. And that changes how you move through life, because you are no longer constantly responding to internal pressure. You are choosing when to act, when to wait, when to simply observe. This choice is where freedom exists. Without it, you are driven by every feeling. With it, you are guided by understanding, and understanding reduces the need for urgency, because you trust the process. You trust that not everything needs to be resolved immediately. You trust that emotions can move on their own. You trust that clarity will come when the mind is calm. And this trust is deeply restorative, because it removes the constant demand for action, the constant pressure to fix, the constant belief that something is wrong. And in that removal, energy returns, not in bursts, but in steadiness. A quiet, sustainable energy that is not drained by urgency, because you are no longer living in a state of internal emergency. You are living in awareness, and awareness does not exhaust you, it supports you. So the next time a strong feeling arises, notice the impulse to act immediately, to fix it, to resolve it, and instead pause, let the feeling be there, without rushing, without pressure, without urgency, just for a moment. And see what happens, not with expectation, but with openness. Because in that pause, you may discover something important, that the wave moves on its own, that the intensity softens without force, that the urgency was not real, it was created. And once you see that, you no longer have to follow it. You can step back, you can breathe, you can allow. And in that allowing, you begin to feel something that may have been missing for a long time. Calm. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer rushing against yourself. And from that calm, healing continues. Quietly, naturally, without force. Because for the first time, you are not treating your inner world like an emergency. You are meeting it with space. And that space is what restores you. And as you begin to slow down that inner urgency, as you stop treating every feeling like something that must be fixed right away, another quiet pattern starts to reveal itself, because even when you are no longer rushing, even when you are allowing your emotions to move, there can still be a subtle tension inside you, a need that doesn't shout but lingers, a desire that says, someone needs to understand this, a hope that says, if they truly see me, then I can finally relax. And without realizing it, you begin to carry another kind of weight, the weight of needing to be understood. Let's go deeper. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from doing too much, or even from feeling too much. It comes from trying to be seen, trying to be validated, trying to make your inner experience make sense to someone else. At first, this seems natural. You feel something deeply, and you want to share it. You want someone to hear you, to acknowledge it, to say, I understand. Because that kind of response feels comforting. It feels like connection. It feels like relief. And in many ways, it is. But slowly, without noticing, this simple desire can become something heavier. It can become a need, not just to express, but to be confirmed. Not just to share, but to be validated. And once that shift happens, your peace begins to depend on something outside of you. You no longer just feel your experience. You wait for someone else to agree with it, to reflect it back, to make it real. And when that does not happen, something tightens. You feel misunderstood, ignored, dismissed, alone. And that feeling can be more exhausting than the original emotion itself. Because now, you are not only dealing with what you feel, you are also dealing with the gap between your experience and how it is received. This is where the exhaustion begins to grow. You try to explain yourself. You search for better words. You repeat the story in different ways. You adjust your tone, your expression, your delivery, hoping that this time they will understand. And each attempt takes energy, because you are not just speaking, you are trying to bridge a distance between your inner world and someone else's perception. But that distance cannot always be closed. No matter how clearly you speak, no matter how honestly you share, no matter how much you try, there are moments when others will not fully understand, not because they don't care, but because they cannot feel exactly what you feel. They do not have your history, your perspective, your internal landscape, and expecting them to match your experience perfectly creates strain, because you are asking for something that is not always possible. This is one of the quiet truths that Buddhist teachings reveal. Your experience is valid, even if no one else confirms it. Your feelings are real, even if they are not understood. Your inner world does not need external agreement to exist. But when you believe that it does, you create dependency, a subtle form of attachment, where your emotional state is influenced by how others respond. And that attachment is draining, because it puts your peace in someone else's hands. If they understand you, you feel relief. If they don't, you feel tension. And that cycle repeats again and again, until you begin to feel tired, not just of the emotion, but of explaining it, of trying to be seen, of trying to be understood. This is the exhaustion of being understood. It is not about communication itself, it is about the pressure behind it, the pressure to be validated, to be confirmed, to have your inner experience mirrored perfectly. And when that pressure is present, even simple conversations become heavy, because you are not just speaking, you are hoping that this time it will land, hoping that this time someone will say the right thing, hoping that this time the gap will close. But the gap is not the problem. The expectation is, because the more you expect others to fully understand you, the more you feel the distance when they don't. And that distance creates emotional fatigue, Not because something is wrong, but because you are holding on to a need that cannot always be fulfilled. This is where a shift begins, not in how you communicate, but in why you communicate. You begin to notice the difference between sharing and seeking validation. Sharing is open. It is an expression. It does not require a specific response. It is simply the act of letting something be known. Seeking validation is different. It carries an expectation. It looks for confirmation. It needs agreement. And when that agreement is not given, it creates tension. So instead of trying to change others, you begin to soften the expectation. You allow your experience to exist without needing it to be approved. You let your feelings be what they are, without waiting for someone else to confirm them. And in doing that, something lightens, because you are no longer carrying the extra weight of expectation. You are not measuring your experience against someone else's response. You are not depending on their understanding to feel settled. You are simply allowing yourself to feel and express without attachment. This does not mean you stop connecting. It does not mean you stop sharing. It means you release the pressure behind it. You speak because it is true for you, not because you need a certain reaction. You express because it feels right, not because you are seeking validation. And when you do that, communication becomes lighter, more natural, less draining, because it is no longer a task to be completed. It is an experience to be shared. This also changes how you listen, because when you are not focused on being understood, you become more open to understanding others. You are not waiting for your turn to explain. You are present, you are engaged, and that presence creates a different kind of connection, one that is not based on perfect understanding, but on mutual awareness, on being there, without needing everything to align. And that kind of connection is more sustainable because it does not carry the weight of expectation. It allows space for differences, for misunderstandings, for imperfection. And in that space, there is less tension, less effort, less exhaustion. You also begin to see something important. Not every experience needs to be shared. Some things can be held gently, without being explained. Not because they are hidden, but because they are complete, within you. You do not need to externalize everything to make it real. You do not need to process everything through conversation to understand it. Some clarity comes in silence. Some understanding comes from simply being with what you feel. And when you allow that, you reduce the need to constantly express. You reduce the pressure to be understood. You create space for your experience to settle on its own. This is not isolation. It is self-sufficiency, a quiet ability to hold your own experience without needing external confirmation. And that ability restores energy, because you are no longer reaching outward for something that must come from within. You are no longer dependent on responses to feel stable. You are grounded in your own awareness, and from that grounding, everything becomes simpler. You speak when it feels natural. You listen without pressure. You share without expectation. You receive without needing to interpret everything. And in that simplicity, there is ease. Not because everyone understands you perfectly, but because you no longer need them to. This does not mean you stop valuing connection. It means you stop attaching your peace to it. You allow connection to be what it is, without turning it into a requirement for your well-being. And in doing that, you free yourself from a quiet but constant source of exhaustion, because trying to be understood all the time is heavy. It requires effort. It creates tension. It drains emotional energy. But allowing yourself to exist without needing that constant validation is light. It requires less. It creates space. It restores balance. So the next time you feel the urge to explain yourself again and again, pause, notice what is underneath. Is it expression or is it expectation? And if it is expectation, gently release it. Let your experience be enough, as it is, without needing to be confirmed, without needing to be understood perfectly, just as it is. And in that release, you may feel something shift, a quiet relief, a sense that you no longer have to work so hard to be seen, because you already are, not through someone else's understanding, but through your own awareness. And that awareness is enough. Enough to hold what you feel, enough to give it space, enough to allow it to pass. And from that place, energy returns, not because anything changed outside, but because something softened inside. The need to be understood is no longer carrying your weight. And without that weight, you begin to feel lighter, clearer, more at ease, because you are no longer chasing validation. You are resting in presence, and in that rest, healing continues, quietly, naturally, without force, because for the first time, you are not asking others to complete your experience. You are allowing it to be complete within you, and that is where true freedom begins. And as you begin to release the need to be understood, as you stop placing your peace in someone else's response, something even quieter starts to come into view. Because sometimes, even when nothing is being demanded from the outside, something inside still feels unsettled, a restlessness that doesn't make sense, a pull toward intensity, even when you say you want peace, a strange familiarity with emotional highs and lows that feels almost normal. And if you look closely, you may begin to notice something uncomfortable. That part of you has learned to live in chaos. Let's go deeper. There is a pattern that hides in plain sight. It does not feel like a problem at first. In fact, it can feel alive. Strong emotions, deep reactions, intense connections, sudden highs, followed by heavy lows. It feels like something is happening, like life is full, like you are deeply engaged. But underneath that intensity, there is something else, a dependency, a quiet attachment to emotional stimulation. This is the subtle addiction to emotional intensity. It does not look like addiction in the usual sense. There are no obvious signs, no clear substance, no visible behavior that others would question. But internally, there is a craving, not for calm, but for feeling something strongly. Because over time, the mind can become used to intensity, used to drama, used to the surge of emotion that comes with conflict, uncertainty, or emotional highs. And once that becomes familiar, stillness begins to feel strange, almost uncomfortable. Silence feels empty. Calm feels boring. Peace feels unfamiliar. And so, without realizing it, you begin to seek intensity, not consciously, but through patterns. You revisit emotionally charged memories. You engage in conversations that trigger strong reactions. You stay connected to situations that create emotional movement. Because that movement feels like life. Even if it is draining, this is how chaos becomes normalized, not because you want suffering, but because your system has adapted to it. It has learned to function in intensity, to expect it, to rely on it. And when it is not there, something feels missing. This is one of the quiet traps of emotional exhaustion, because it is not always caused by too much happening. It can also be caused by the constant need for something to happen. The mind becomes restless in stillness. It looks for stimulation, for something to react to, for something to engage with emotionally. And that constant engagement uses energy, even when it feels familiar, even when it feels natural. Think about how often you find yourself drawn to emotionally charged situations. Conversations that carry tension, memories that bring strong feelings, thoughts that create urgency. Even when you know they drain you, there is a part of you that returns to them because they feel alive. This is not a flaw, it is conditioning. The nervous system adapts to what it experiences repeatedly. If you have lived in environments where emotions were intense, where calm was rare, where stability was inconsistent, your system may have learned that intensity is normal, that stillness is not safe, that peace is unfamiliar. So even when life becomes quieter, you may feel unsettled, not because something is wrong, but because something is different, and the system does not yet recognize it as safe. So it seeks what it knows, intensity, even if that intensity is exhausting. This is why some people feel tired, but cannot rest, because rest feels empty. It lacks the stimulation they are used to, and without that stimulation, the mind starts searching, creating scenarios, replaying emotions, engaging with anything that brings movement. This is not conscious. It happens automatically, but the effect is clear. Energy is constantly being used, not for real situations, but for internally generated intensity. This is what makes it subtle, because from the outside, nothing is happening, but inside, there is constant activity, constant emotional engagement, constant stimulation, and over time, that becomes draining. Not in a sharp way, but in a steady, ongoing depletion. This is where awareness becomes important. Not to judge yourself, but to see the pattern, to notice when you are drawn toward intensity, when you seek out emotional movement, even when you don't need it, when you feel uncomfortable in calm, and look for something to fill the space. This noticing is the beginning of change, because once you see it, you are no longer fully inside it. You have a choice, a small one, but important. To stay with the calm instead of escaping it, to allow stillness, even if it feels unfamiliar, to resist the urge to create intensity, just to feel something. This is not easy, because the mind may react. It may say, "This is boring, this feels empty, something is missing," and those thoughts can pull you back into old patterns. But if you stay, even for a moment, you begin to notice something different. The calm is not empty. It is quiet. It is spacious. It is not lacking. It is open. But because you are not used to it, it feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar often feels uncomfortable. Not because it is bad, but because it is new. So the practice is not to force yourself into calm. It is to become comfortable with it, gradually. To sit in stillness without needing to fill it, to feel peace without questioning it, to allow moments where nothing is happening, without searching for something. This shifts your relationship with emotional experience. You no longer need constant intensity to feel alive. You begin to appreciate subtlety, small sensations, gentle emotions, quiet presence, and in that shift, your system begins to recalibrate. It learns that calm is safe, that stillness is not a problem, that peace is not emptiness. It is rest. This recalibration takes time, because patterns that have been repeated for years do not disappear instantly. But each moment of awareness, each time you choose not to engage with unnecessary intensity, each time you allow calm to exist, you are changing something. You are teaching your system a new way of being. And slowly, the need for intensity decreases, not completely, but enough to create balance. You still feel deeply. You still experience emotions, but you are not dependent on high intensity to feel alive. You can exist in a quieter state without discomfort. And that changes everything, because now your energy is not constantly being pulled into emotional spikes. It is conserved, it is stable, it is available. This also affects how you relate to others. You are less drawn to drama, less reactive to conflict, less engaged in situations that create unnecessary emotional movement. Not because you avoid life, but because you no longer need intensity to feel connected. You can connect through presence, through calm, through simple awareness, and that kind of connection is less draining, more sustainable, more real, because it is not built on emotional spikes. but on steady attention. This is where emotional exhaustion begins to fade. Not because life becomes easy, but because you are no longer feeding patterns that drain you. You are no longer creating intensity where it is not needed. You are allowing life to be as it is. And in that allowing, there is less movement, less tension, less energy being used unnecessarily. So the next time you feel the urge to engage with something intense, pause, notice it. Not as something to follow, but as something to observe, and then gently return to what is already here, the breath, the body, the quiet, even if it feels unfamiliar, because in that unfamiliar space, there is something valuable, something that has been missing. Rest, not just physical rest, but emotional rest, a break from constant engagement, a break from constant intensity, a break from patterns that keep you active, even when you are still. And in that rest, you begin to feel something shift, a softening, a slowing down, a return to balance, not because you forced it, but because you stopped feeding what was draining you, and that is where true recovery begins. Not in adding more, but in removing what is unnecessary, in allowing calm, in reducing intensity, in choosing presence over stimulation. And from that place, you begin to feel lighter, more stable, more at ease, because you are no longer dependent on chaos to feel alive. You are alive, in the quiet, and that quiet is where your energy returns, slowly, naturally, without force, because for the first time, you are not chasing intensity, you are allowing stillness, and in that stillness, you begin to rest, not just on the surface, but deeply, where it matters most, and from there, healing continues. And as you begin to loosen your grip on intensity, as the need for constant emotional movement starts to quiet down, something unfamiliar begins to appear. Not excitement, not stimulation, and not even clarity, but space, a quiet, open space that can feel strange at first, almost uncomfortable, because for so long, your mind has been filled with thoughts, with reactions, with emotional activity. And now, there is less of that, and in its place, there is something you are not used to meeting: nothingness. Let's go deeper. There is a moment that many people avoid without realizing it. A pause, where nothing is happening. No strong thoughts, no urgent emotions, no clear direction, just stillness. And instead of relaxing into that stillness, the mind reacts. It starts searching, looking for something to think about, something to feel, something to engage with, because emptiness feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar often feels uncomfortable, so the mind fills the space with noise, with distraction, with activity, anything to avoid sitting in that quiet. But that quiet is not empty in the way you think. It is not lacking. It is not meaningless. It is simply unfilled. And that is where energy begins to rebuild. The problem is, most people never stay there long enough to experience it. Because the moment stillness appears, they move away. They pick up their phone, they start thinking, they look for something to do, not because they need to, but because they are not comfortable with nothing happening. This is one of the deeper causes of emotional exhaustion, the inability to remain in stillness without needing to fill it. Because when you constantly fill every space, your system never fully rests. Even when you are not physically active, your mind is working, and that work consumes energy. The art of sitting with nothingness is not about doing something special. It is about not doing, not in a passive way, but in a conscious way. A willingness to be present without needing to engage, to sit without reaching for distraction, to exist without needing to define the moment. This is simple, but not easy, because the mind is used to movement. It is used to stimulation. It is used to having something to focus on. So when that is removed, it begins to react. You may feel restless. You may feel bored. You may feel a subtle discomfort, like something is missing. And that feeling is important because it shows you how dependent the mind has become on activity. Not just physical activity, but mental and emotional activity. And that dependency is what keeps you from resting deeply, because rest is not just about stopping the body. It is about allowing the mind to settle, and the mind can only settle when it is not constantly being fed. This is where stillness becomes powerful, not as something to achieve, but as something to allow. You sit, you breathe, you notice, and you do nothing to change the experience. No effort to make it peaceful, no attempt to make it meaningful, no need to create something out of the moment. Just being. At first, this may feel empty because you are not used to it. But if you stay, something begins to shift. The restlessness softens, the urge to move decreases. The mind begins to slow down naturally, not because you forced it, but because there is nothing feeding it. And in that slowing, there is a different kind of presence, one that is not driven by thought, not driven by emotion, but simply aware. This awareness is quiet. It does not need to say anything. It does not need to do anything. It just exists. And in that existence, there is rest, deep rest. Not the kind that comes from sleep, but the kind that comes from no longer being engaged, no longer being pulled, no longer being stimulated. This is what rebuilds energy, not activity, not even positive thinking, but the absence of constant input. Because your system needs space, space to recover, space to reset, space to return to its natural balance. And that space is found in stillness. But stillness is not something you create. It is something you stop interrupting. You stop filling the moment. You stop adding noise. You stop searching for something to do, and you allow what is already there to be enough. This is where a deeper understanding begins. Nothingness is not the absence of life. It is the foundation of it. It is the space from which everything arises. And when you are comfortable in that space, you are no longer dependent on constant stimulation to feel alive. You can simply be. And that changes your relationship with everything. Because you are no longer running from emptiness. You are resting in it. This rest is not dull. It is not lifeless. It is quiet, but full. Full of awareness, full of presence, full of subtle experience, the sensation of breath, the feeling of the body, the sounds around you. All of these become more noticeable when the mind is not distracted, and in noticing them, you become grounded, not in thought, but in reality. This grounding is stabilizing because it brings you out of the constant movement of the mind and into the simplicity of the present moment. And the present moment does not require effort. It is already here. You do not need to create it. You do not need to improve it. You just need to notice it. And in that noticing, there is ease. Because you are no longer trying to be somewhere else. You are here, without pressure, without urgency, without expectation. This is what allows the nervous system to relax. Because there is no demand, no task, no problem to solve, just presence. And presence is enough. Over time, this becomes more natural. You find yourself less drawn to constant activity, less dependent on distraction, more comfortable with quiet, more at ease with doing nothing. And in that comfort, your energy stabilizes, because it is no longer being used unnecessarily. It is no longer being drained by constant engagement. It is available, ready, sustained. This also changes how you experience life, because you are no longer seeking something to fill every moment. You are allowing moments to be what they are, simple, quiet, unremarkable. And in that simplicity, there is peace. Not the kind that comes from achieving something, but the kind that comes from not needing to achieve anything in that moment. This peace is subtle, but powerful, because it is not dependent on conditions. It exists, even when nothing is happening. And when you can access that, you are no longer afraid of emptiness. You are no longer running from stillness. You are no longer filling space out of discomfort. You are resting within it. And that rest is what restores you. So the next time you find yourself in a quiet moment, resist the urge to fill it, just for a little while. Stay, sit, breathe, let the moment be empty without changing it. And notice what happens, not immediately, but gradually. The discomfort fades, the mind slows, the body softens, and something deeper begins to emerge. A sense of calm, a sense of presence, a sense that nothing is missing, because in that moment, everything you need is already there. And in that realization, energy returns, not from doing more, but from allowing less, from letting the mind settle, from letting the body rest, from letting the moment be enough. And that is the art, not of adding, but of removing, not of controlling, but of allowing, not of filling, but of resting. And from that place, healing continues, quietly, naturally, without force, because for the first time, you are not trying to escape the space. You are living in it, and in that space, you begin to feel whole again. And as you begin to rest in that quiet space, as stillness stops feeling empty and starts feeling safe, something else slowly comes into focus. Because even in silence, even when your own mind is calm, there is another place your energy can be pulled. Not from your thoughts, not from your past, but from other people, a subtle pull that feels like care, a deep sensitivity that feels like love, a habit of feeling what others feel as if it were your own. And at first, it feels like a gift, but over time, it can become something heavy. Let's go deeper. There is a kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from caring too deeply, without boundaries, not just understanding others, but absorbing them, not just listening, but carrying, not just feeling with someone, but feeling for them and instead of them. This is what can be called hyper-empathy. It is not simply kindness. It is not just compassion. It is an overextension of emotional connection, where the line between your experience and someone else's begins to disappear. You don't just notice their pain, you feel it. You don't just understand their stress, you take it on. You don't just support them, you become responsible for their emotional state. And at first, this may feel natural, especially if you have always been the one who understands, the one who listens, the one who senses what others are going through, even without words. But over time, this ability can turn into a quiet form of self-abandonment, because while you are tuned into others, you begin to lose connection with yourself. Your attention moves outward, your energy follows, and your own needs become less visible, not because they are gone, but because they are no longer your focus. You are focused on how others feel, what they need, what they are going through, and slowly, you begin to adjust yourself around them. You become more accommodating, more available, more responsive, even when you are tired, even when you need space, even when something inside you is asking for rest, because there is a belief, often unspoken, that their feelings matter more, or that your role is to help, to fix, to support. And while that may come from a place of care, it comes at a cost, because emotional energy is not unlimited. Every time you absorb someone else's state, you use your own. Every time you carry something that is not yours, you lose space for what is yours, and over time, that imbalance grows. You feel drained without knowing why. You feel overwhelmed, even when your own life is not demanding. You feel heavy after conversations that should have been simple, because you are not just interacting, you are internalizing, taking in more than you can hold. This is where the hidden cost appears, not in dramatic moments, but in quiet depletion, a slow loss of energy, a gradual fading of clarity, a growing distance from your own center, because you are constantly reaching outward, constantly feeling for others, constantly adjusting your internal state to match theirs. And in doing that, you lose stability, because your emotional state is no longer grounded in you. It is influenced by everything around you. This is why hyper-empathy can be exhausting, not because empathy itself is wrong, but because it has no boundary. It does not stop at understanding. It moves into absorption, and absorption consumes energy. Buddhist teachings offer a different approach. They do not reject compassion, they value it deeply, but they distinguish between compassion and attachment, between caring and carrying. True compassion does not require you to take on someone else's suffering. It requires you to see it clearly, without becoming it, to be present, without losing yourself, to support, without absorbing. This is a subtle but important difference, because when you absorb, you become overwhelmed. When you observe, you remain stable, and stability is what allows you to offer real support. Not reactive, not draining, but grounded. This begins with awareness, noticing when you are crossing that line, when you move from understanding into internalizing, when you start feeling responsible for someone else's emotions, when you begin to carry what is not yours. These moments are often quiet, a shift in your body, a tightening, a sense of heaviness, a loss of your own clarity. And instead of ignoring it, you pause. You recognize what is happening, not with judgment, but with honesty. This is not mine to carry. That sentence changes everything, because it brings you back to yourself, back to your own experience, back to your own center. It does not mean you stop caring. It means you care differently, without losing your boundaries, without abandoning yourself, without turning someone else's pain into your responsibility. This also changes how you listen. You are still present, still attentive, still open, but you are not merging. You are not taking on. You are allowing space between you and the other person. And in that space, there is clarity, because you are no longer clouded by their emotions. You can see more clearly. You can respond more wisely. You can support without being drained. This is what makes compassion sustainable. It is not based on emotional intensity. It is based on awareness. And awareness does not exhaust you. It stabilizes you. It allows you to remain present without losing energy. This also requires letting go of certain beliefs, the belief that you must always be there, that you must always understand, that you must always help, because those beliefs create pressure, and pressure leads to overextension, which leads to exhaustion. Instead, you begin to accept something simple. You can care without fixing everything. You can listen without carrying everything. You can support without losing yourself. This acceptance creates balance, and balance restores energy. You also begin to check in with yourself, not just others. You ask, how do I feel right now? What do I need? Do I have the capacity to hold this? And if the answer is no, you allow yourself to step back, not as rejection, but as self-preservation, because you cannot give from a place that is empty. You cannot support others if you are constantly drained. And recognizing your limits is not selfish. It is necessary. It is what allows you to remain available in a healthy way, without losing yourself in the process. Over time, this changes your relationships. They become less intense, but more stable, less draining, but more genuine, because you are no longer trying to be everything for everyone. You are simply being present, and that presence is enough. It does not require you to absorb. It does not require you to carry. It does not require you to lose yourself. It allows you to connect without collapsing. And that is what protects your energy, because you are no longer constantly giving from a place of depletion. You are giving from awareness, from clarity, from balance. And that kind of giving does not exhaust you. it sustains you. So the next time you feel pulled into someone else's emotional state, pause, notice the shift, and gently return to yourself, not by closing off, but by grounding, by remembering where you end and where they begin, by allowing their experience to be theirs and yours to be yours. And in that separation, there is freedom, not distance, but clarity, not detachment, but stability. And from that stability, energy returns, because you are no longer carrying what does not belong to you. You are no longer losing yourself in the process of caring. You are present, balanced, whole, and from that place, your compassion becomes stronger, not because it is deeper, but because it is sustainable. And in that sustainability, you begin to feel something shift, a sense of lightness, a sense of space, a sense that you can care without being consumed. And that is where emotional exhaustion begins to fade, not because you stopped feeling, but because you stopped over-feeling beyond your capacity. And in that balance, healing continues, quietly, naturally, without force, because for the first time, you are not abandoning yourself in order to be there for others. You are including yourself in the care you give, and that inclusion changes everything. And as you begin to return to yourself, as you stop carrying what does not belong to you, something else becomes clear in a very quiet way. Because even when you are no longer absorbing others, even when your boundaries are stronger, there is still something inside that can stretch a simple feeling into something heavy. Not because the feeling is too much, but because of what the mind adds to it. A single moment becomes a long story. A simple emotion becomes a complex narrative. A passing wave becomes something that lingers, and slowly, without noticing, you begin to feel more than what is actually there. Let's go deeper. There is a difference between feeling and extending a feeling. Feeling is direct, it is immediate. It is what arises in the moment, a sensation in the body, a shift in the chest, a quiet movement of emotion. It comes, and if allowed, it passes. But the mind rarely lets it stay that simple. It begins to add, to interpret, to build a story around what is happening, why this is happening, what it means, what it says about you, what it says about others, what might happen next. And in doing so, it stretches the experience. It takes something small and makes it larger, not intentionally, but automatically. This is where emotional exhaustion often grows, not from the original feeling, but from the narrative built around it. A moment of sadness becomes, "I always feel this way." A moment of rejection becomes, "No one understands me." A moment of uncertainty becomes, "I'll never figure this out." And each of these thoughts adds weight, not because they are true, but because they are repeated. And repetition strengthens experience. The more you think something, the more real it feels. The more you revisit it, the more it expands, until the original feeling is no longer the main issue. The narrative is, and the narrative does not end easily, because it feeds itself. Each thought leads to another. Each interpretation leads to another. Each conclusion leads to another question. And the mind becomes busy, not with the feeling itself, but with everything built around it. This is what creates emotional heaviness, not the emotion, but the extension, the exaggeration, the continuous layering of thought on top of sensation. This is where the practice of emotional minimalism begins, not by reducing your feelings, but by reducing what you add to them. You allow the emotion, but you do not build a story around it. You feel it without extending it. You experience it without turning it into something larger than it is. This is a subtle shift, but it changes everything, because you are no longer feeding the emotion. You are allowing it to exist in its simplest form, without commentary, without interpretation, without projection. And in that simplicity, the emotion becomes lighter, not because it is less real, but because it is not being amplified. Think about how often a feeling lasts longer than it needs to, not because it is strong, but because it is being revisited, replayed, expanded. The mind keeps returning to it, adding new layers, creating new meanings, and each layer keeps the emotion alive. This is not necessary. The emotion itself is temporary. It does not need to be extended, but the mind does not always know that, so it continues. Trying to understand, trying to explain, trying to make sense of what is already complete, and in doing so, it keeps the experience active. This is where energy is used, not in feeling, but in maintaining the story, in holding the narrative, in keeping the loop going. And that loop becomes exhausting, because it does not resolve, it continues, until you interrupt it, not by force, but by simplicity. You return to the raw experience, what is actually here, right now. Not the story, not the interpretation, just the sensation, a tightness, a heaviness, a movement in the body, and you stay with that, without adding, without explaining, without expanding, just feeling. This is emotional minimalism. It is not about suppressing, it is about simplifying, removing what is unnecessary, allowing only what is real to remain. And when you do that, something changes. The emotion does not grow, it does not spread, it stays contained. And because it is contained, it can pass, naturally, without resistance, without interference, without being prolonged. This also changes how you relate to your thoughts, because you begin to see that not every thought needs to be followed. Not every interpretation needs to be believed. Not every story needs to be completed. Some thoughts are simply extensions, not reflections of truth, but additions, and you can choose not to engage, not by pushing them away, but by not feeding them, by returning again and again to what is actually present. This requires awareness, because the mind is fast. It builds narratives quickly. It moves from sensation to story in seconds. So the practice is to notice that movement, to catch it early, to see when a simple feeling is turning into something larger, and to gently step back, not into analysis, but into presence. You feel the emotion, you acknowledge it, and you stop there. No further, no extension, no elaboration, just the experience. This may feel incomplete at first, because the mind is used to finishing the story, to reaching a conclusion, to creating meaning. But meaning is not always necessary. Sometimes experience is enough, and when you allow that, you reduce the burden, because you are no longer carrying layers of thought. You are only holding what is real, and what is real is often lighter than what is imagined. This also creates a different relationship with time, because narratives often extend experience into the past and future. You think about what happened, you think about what might happen, and the present moment becomes filled with both. But emotional minimalism brings you back to now, to what is actually happening in this moment. And in this moment, the experience is usually simpler, less complicated, less overwhelming, because it is not mixed with everything else. It is just what is here. And that simplicity is calming. It reduces mental activity, it reduces emotional intensity, it creates space. And space is where energy returns, because you are no longer using it to maintain complex narratives. You are allowing experience to be direct, clear, uncomplicated. This does not mean you never reflect. It does not mean you never think. It means you choose when to engage. You do not let every feeling turn into a full story. You do not let every moment expand beyond itself. You keep things simple, and in that simplicity, there is clarity, because you are no longer lost in layers. You are seeing things as they are, without distortion, without exaggeration, without extension. And that clarity reduces exhaustion, because confusion is draining, overthinking is draining, narrative building is draining, but direct experience is not. It is natural, it moves, it resolves without effort. This is what makes emotional minimalism powerful. It does not require you to do more. It asks you to do less, to remove what is unnecessary, to stop adding weight, to allow what is already there, to move freely. And in doing so, you begin to feel lighter, not because you are avoiding emotions, but because you are no longer amplifying them. You are experiencing them fully, but simply, without extension, without exaggeration, without turning them into something they are not. And that changes everything, because now emotions are no longer something to manage, they are something to experience, and experience does not exhaust you. It flows, it moves, it passes, without needing to be controlled. So the next time a feeling arises, notice what the mind does. Notice the urge to explain, to interpret, to build a story, and instead pause. Return to the feeling itself. Stay with it, without adding, without extending, just as it is, and watch what happens, not immediately, but gradually. The intensity softens, the duration shortens, the experience becomes lighter. Because it is no longer being carried forward, it is allowed to complete itself, and in that completion, there is release, and in that release, there is energy. Energy that is no longer tied up in narratives. Energy that is no longer drained by overthinking. Energy that is available for presence, for awareness, for living. And from that place, you begin to move differently, not reacting, not extending, but experiencing, fully, simply, and letting go. And that is where emotional exhaustion begins to dissolve. Not through effort, but through simplicity. Not through control, but through allowing. And from there, healing continues, quietly, naturally, without force, because for the first time, you are not turning your feelings into something heavy. You are letting them be what they are. And in that, you find ease, real ease, the kind that does not come from solving everything, but from not adding more than what is already there. And that ease is what restores you. And as you begin to simplify your inner world, as you stop stretching emotions into long stories, something even more subtle begins to reveal itself. Because even when you are no longer adding narratives, even when you are allowing feelings to come and go, there can still be a quiet tension inside, a watching, a checking, a constant scanning of your own state. Why do I feel like this? Is this normal? Am I healing fast enough? Is this getting better or worse? And without realizing it, you turn your attention inward, not with ease, but with pressure. Let's go deeper. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from looking at yourself too much. Not physically, but mentally. A constant observation of your own emotions, a habit of analyzing every feeling, a need to understand every shift in your internal state. At first, this may seem helpful. You think you are becoming more aware, more in control, more in touch with yourself. But slowly, it becomes something else, a loop, where you are not just feeling your emotions. You are monitoring them, tracking them, judging them, trying to measure your progress. And that process becomes heavy, because instead of simply experiencing, you are observing yourself experiencing. There is a distance, a split. One part of you feels, the other part watches, evaluates, and reacts. And maintaining that split takes energy, a lot of it, because you are never fully in the moment. You are always slightly outside of it, checking, assessing, trying to figure out what is happening. This is the trap of constant self-monitoring. It looks like awareness, but it feels like tension, because it is not relaxed, it is not open, it is controlled. It carries a subtle urgency, a need to understand everything, a need to get it right, a need to make sure you are okay, and that need creates pressure, because emotions are not meant to be analyzed constantly, they are meant to be experienced. But when you monitor them, you interrupt that experience, you turn it into a task, something to manage, something to figure out, and that shift changes how it feels. A simple emotion becomes complex, not because it is, but because of how you are relating to it. Think about how often you ask yourself questions like, why am I feeling this? What does this mean? How do I fix this? Is this progress? Am I doing this right? These questions may seem harmless, but they keep your mind active. They keep you in analysis mode. They prevent you from simply being, and that constant activity drains energy because the mind is always working, always trying to solve something, even when nothing needs to be solved. This is where the confusion begins. You start to feel tired, not because of the emotion, but because of the effort to understand it. And that effort never ends, because the mind can always find another question, another angle, another interpretation. So the process continues. You feel something, you analyze it, you analyze it, you feel more, you feel more, you analyze again, and the loop goes on. This is not clarity, this is over-engagement, and over-engagement leads to fatigue. Buddhist teachings point to a different way, a way of awareness that is not analytical, but observational, not driven by questions, but by presence. Instead of asking, why is this happening? You notice, this is happening. Instead of trying to understand the emotion, you feel it directly, without commentary, without interpretation, without turning it into something to solve. This is a different kind of awareness, one that does not divide you, one that does not create distance, one that allows you to be fully present in your experience. And in that presence, there is less effort, because you are not doing anything extra. You are not adding layers. You are not trying to control the process. You are simply allowing it. This allowance reduces tension because the mind is no longer working constantly. It is not trying to figure everything out. It is resting within the experience. This is what brings relief, not more understanding, but less interference, not more analysis, but more presence. Because sometimes the need to understand is what keeps you stuck. It keeps you looking at the emotion instead of moving through it. It keeps you focused on the process instead of allowing the process to unfold. And that focus becomes heavy. This is especially common when you are trying to heal, because healing often comes with expectations. You want to feel better. You want to see progress. You want to know that things are improving. And so you monitor, you check, you evaluate, trying to measure something that does not move in a straight line. And when it does not meet your expectations, you feel frustrated, you feel stuck, you feel like something is wrong. But the issue is not the pace of healing. It is the constant observation of it, because healing, like emotion, needs space. It needs room to move, to shift, to unfold. And when you are constantly watching it, you create pressure, a subtle demand that it should be different. And that demand slows it down. Not because healing is resisting you, but because you are interfering with its natural rhythm. This is where the shift begins. Not by stopping awareness, but by softening it, making it lighter, less focused, less analytical, more open, more relaxed. You still notice what you feel, but you do not chase it. You do not question it immediately. You do not try to define it. You let it exist without needing to explain it. This creates space, and in that space, the experience becomes simpler, less complicated, less heavy. Because it is no longer being examined from every angle. It is just being felt. This also helps you reconnect with your body, because self-monitoring often keeps you in your head, thinking, analyzing, evaluating. But presence brings you back to sensation, to breath, to what is actually happening, beyond thought. And in that return, there is grounding, a sense of being here instead of being inside your mind. This grounding is important because it stabilizes you. It gives you something real to rest in, not concepts, not interpretations, but direct experience. And direct experience does not require effort. It is already there. You just need to notice it, without turning it into something more. Over time, this changes how you relate to yourself. You become less critical, less focused on fixing, less concerned with constant improvement, and more accepting of what is, not in a passive way, but in a natural way. You allow yourself to feel without needing to track it. You allow yourself to exist without needing to evaluate it. And in that allowance, there is ease, because you are no longer under observation. You are not performing. You are not being measured. You are simply being. And that is where energy returns. Because you are no longer using it to monitor yourself. You are no longer splitting your attention. You are no longer creating internal pressure. You are whole, present, undivided. This does not mean you never reflect. It means you choose when to reflect. You do not do it constantly. You do not turn every moment into analysis. You allow space between reflection and experience. And in that space, there is rest, real rest. Not just from activity, but from self-observation, from constant checking, from the need to understand everything. And that rest restores you. So the next time you notice yourself analyzing your feelings, pause gently, without judgment, and return to the feeling itself. Without questions, without interpretation, just as it is. And stay there for a moment. Let it be simple. Let it be direct. Let it be enough. And notice what happens, not in your thoughts, but in your body. The tension softens, the pressure eases, the experience becomes lighter, because you are no longer turning it into something complex. You are allowing it to be what it is. And in that simplicity, there is freedom. Freedom from constant monitoring, freedom from over-analysis, freedom from the need to get it right. And from that freedom, energy returns, quietly, naturally, without force. Because for the first time, you are not watching yourself live. You are living fully, directly, without interruption. And that is what brings you back to clarity, back to ease, back to yourself. And from there, healing continues, not as something you track, but as something you allow. And in that allowance, you finally begin to rest. And as you begin to step out of that constant self-monitoring, as you stop watching yourself from a distance, something else quietly comes into view. Because even when you are no longer analyzing every feeling, even when you are present, there can still be a pressure that follows you, a timeline that lives in your mind, a quiet expectation that says, by now, this should be over. And without realizing it, you begin to measure your healing. Let's go deeper. There is a hidden clock inside the mind. It does not show hours or minutes, but it keeps track of something else, progress. It measures where you are against where you think you should be. It compares your current state to an imagined version of yourself that feels better, stronger, more healed. And when those two do not match, it creates pressure. You begin to think, I should be over this by now. I thought I would feel better by now. Why am I still dealing with this? What is wrong with me? These thoughts seem small, but they carry weight, because they turn your experience into a problem, not because of what you feel, but because of when you feel it. This is what can be called psychological time, not real time, but mental time. The time created by expectation, by comparison, by the belief that your inner world should follow a certain schedule. And when it doesn't, you feel behind, you feel stuck, you feel like something is wrong. This is one of the quiet causes of emotional exhaustion. Because you are not just experiencing your emotions, You are measuring them, judging them, comparing them to a timeline that does not exist outside your mind. And that comparison creates tension. Because reality does not follow your expectations, healing does not move in straight lines, emotions do not disappear on schedule. Some days feel lighter, some days feel heavy again, some moments feel clear, some moments feel confusing. And this movement is natural. But when you overlay a timeline onto it, you turn that natural movement into frustration. Because you expect consistency, you expect progress, you expect resolution. And when those expectations are not met, you resist, not the emotion itself, but the fact that it is still there. This resistance is exhausting, because you are fighting something that is already happening. You are arguing with reality, saying, this should be different. And that argument uses energy, a lot of it, because it never ends. Reality remains as it is, and the mind keeps insisting that it should not. This is where the shift begins, not by changing your emotions, but by changing your relationship with time. You begin to see that healing is not something you achieve. It is something that unfolds, not in a straight line, but in waves, not according to your expectations, but according to deeper processes that are not always visible. This requires letting go of the timeline, letting go of the idea that you should be somewhere else by now. And this is not easy, because the mind likes structure, it likes knowing, it likes progress, it likes the feeling of moving forward. But emotional healing does not always provide that. It moves in cycles, in layers, in ways that are not always logical. And when you accept that, something softens. You stop asking, why is this still here? And you begin to say, this is here right now. That shift removes pressure, because you are no longer comparing your present to an imagined future. You are simply allowing what is here to exist. This does not mean you stop growing. It means you stop forcing growth to happen on your schedule. You allow it to happen naturally, without rushing, without measuring, without judging. And in that allowance, there is relief. Because you are no longer behind, you are simply where you are, and where you are is enough. This also changes how you experience difficult moments, because instead of thinking, I thought I was past this, you begin to see it differently. You see it as part of the process, not a step backward, but a movement within the cycle. And that perspective reduces frustration, because you are not interpreting the experience as failure. You are seeing it as continuation. This reduces emotional strain, because you are no longer adding judgment to the experience. You are allowing it, and allowing uses less energy than resisting. This is where freedom begins, not in eliminating difficult emotions, but in removing the pressure around them, the pressure to be different, the pressure to be better, the pressure to be done, because those pressures create tension, and tension drains you. When you drop psychological time, you drop that tension. You stop living in comparison. You stop measuring your experience. You stop asking when it will end. And you begin to stay with what is, fully, without expectation, without urgency, without the need to move forward, faster. This creates a sense of space, a sense of openness, because you are no longer confined by a timeline. You are not trying to reach a point. You are simply experiencing the moment, and the moment is always manageable. It is the timeline that makes it feel overwhelming. Because the timeline stretches your experience, it turns a single moment into something that should have been resolved already, and that creates pressure. But when you remove that timeline, the moment becomes smaller, simpler, more direct, and easier to hold. This also changes how you relate to yourself, because you are no longer judging your pace. You are no longer comparing your journey. You are no longer asking why you are not where you think you should be. You are accepting where you are, without conditions, without expectations, and that acceptance is deeply, calming, because you are no longer in conflict with yourself. You are aligned, not with an idea of progress, but with reality, and reality does not need to be fixed. It needs to be seen. This is what Buddhist teachings point to. The suffering does not come from the moment itself, but from the resistance to it, from the belief that it should be different, from the expectation that it should have already changed. And when that expectation is dropped, the suffering decreases, because you are no longer adding pressure, you are no longer creating conflict, you are allowing the experience to be what it is. This does not mean you stay the same forever. It means you stop forcing change. And when you stop forcing, change happens naturally, because the system is no longer under pressure. It is no longer being pushed. It is allowed to move at its own pace. And that movement is more sustainable, more real, more aligned, because it is not driven by expectation. It is driven by process. And process cannot be rushed. It unfolds step by step, moment by moment, without needing to be measured. So the next time you notice that thought, I should be healed by now, pause, see it clearly, and gently let it go. Not by arguing with it, but by returning to what is here, this moment, this breath, this experience, without comparison, without expectation, just as it is. And in that return, you may feel something shift, a release, a lightness, a sense that you are no longer behind, because there is nowhere you need to be, except here. And here is enough. Enough to feel, enough to heal, enough to rest, without pressure, without urgency, without the weight of time. And in that freedom, energy returns, because you are no longer using it to measure yourself. You are no longer draining it through comparison. You are simply present. And presence does not exhaust you. It restores you, quietly, naturally, without force. Because for the first time, you are not trying to reach a future version of yourself. You are allowing yourself to be here fully. And in that fullness, healing continues. Not as something you chase, but as something that unfolds. And in that unfolding, you begin to feel at ease, not because everything is finished, but because you are no longer waiting for it to be. And that is where true freedom begins. And as you begin to release that pressure of time, as you stop measuring your healing against an invisible clock, something else becomes easier to notice. Because when the mind is no longer rushing, when it is no longer comparing or forcing progress, your attention naturally begins to drop lower, out of the head and into something more immediate, something that has been speaking the entire time, but often ignored. Your body. There is a language there, quiet, constant, honest, and for a long time, it has been trying to tell you something. Let's go deeper. There is a point where emotional exhaustion does not begin in the mind. It begins in the body. Long before you feel overwhelmed, long before your thoughts become heavy, long before you say, I'm tired, your body has already started speaking. A slight tightness, a subtle pressure, a change in breath, a heaviness in the chest, a tension in the shoulders. These are not random sensations. They are signals, early warnings that something inside you is reaching its limit. But most people do not listen at this stage, not because they cannot feel it, but because they have been trained to ignore it, to push through, to keep going, to override what the body is saying in order to meet expectations, responsibilities, or internal pressure. So the signals continue. They become stronger, more noticeable, harder to ignore, but still, they are often dismissed until the body has no choice but to slow everything down. And that is when burnout becomes visible, not because it suddenly appeared, but because it was building quietly all along. This is why the body is the first teacher of burnout. It speaks before the mind understands. It reacts before the thoughts form. It knows when something is too much, even when you do not admit it to yourself. But to hear this language, you need to shift your attention away from constant thinking and into sensation, into what is actually happening beneath the surface. Because the body does not communicate in words. It communicates in feeling, and those feelings are direct, immediate, unfiltered. They do not explain, they show. This is where a different kind of awareness begins, not analyzing, not interpreting, but sensing. You begin to notice how your breath changes in certain situations, how your chest tightens when something feels off, how your stomach reacts when you are overwhelmed, how your shoulders carry tension when you are holding too much. These sensations are not problems, they are information, and when you learn to read them, you begin to understand yourself in a deeper way, because the body does not lie, it does not create stories, it reflects reality as it is. If something is too much, it shows you. If something is misaligned, it signals you. If something is being forced, it resists. But when you ignore these signals, you disconnect. You lose touch with what is actually happening inside you, and instead you rely only on thought, on logic, on what you think you should be able to handle. And that disconnect creates imbalance, because you are no longer responding to reality. You are responding to expectation. This is where emotional overload begins, not in one moment, but in repeated moments of ignoring the body, saying yes when the body is tight, continuing when the body is tired, engaging when the body is asking for space. Each of these moments adds pressure, and over time, that pressure builds until the system can no longer sustain it. And that is when exhaustion becomes unavoidable. But it does not have to reach that point, because the body gives you many opportunities to adjust, to pause, to listen, to respond differently, before things become overwhelming. The key is awareness, noticing the early signals, the subtle ones, before they become strong. Because the earlier you notice, the easier it is to respond. A slight tightness in the chest can be addressed. A small shift in breathing can be adjusted. A gentle sense of discomfort can be acknowledged. But if these are ignored, they grow. Not because they want to, but because they are not being heard. This is why learning to read your body is so important. It allows you to catch imbalance early, before it becomes exhaustion, before it becomes burnout. And this reading is not complicated, it is simple, but it requires attention. You begin by slowing down just enough to feel, not to think about what you feel, but to actually feel it. Where is the tension? Where is the pressure? Where is the discomfort? And instead of moving away from it, you stay, you observe. You allow yourself to experience it without immediately reacting. This is where understanding begins, because the body is not just showing you what is happening, it is showing you what needs attention. If your chest is tight, something may be overwhelming. If your breath is shallow, something may be creating stress. If your shoulders are tense, something may be being carried unnecessarily. These are not diagnoses, they are invitations to look closer, to adjust, to respond, not from thought, but from awareness. This also changes how you make decisions, because you are no longer relying only on logic. You are including your body. You are noticing how it responds to what you are doing, to what you are considering, to what you are about to say yes to. And that response gives you information, not always clear, but real. You may feel a sense of ease or a sense of resistance, and instead of ignoring that, you include it. You ask yourself, does this feel right in my body, not just in my mind? Because the mind can justify anything, but the body responds honestly. And when you learn to trust that response, you make choices that are more aligned, more sustainable, less draining. This also reduces the need for constant correction, because you are not waiting until something feels overwhelming. You are adjusting early, responding early, before the pressure builds. And that prevents exhaustion, not by avoiding life, but by staying connected to yourself within it. Over time, this connection becomes stronger, more natural. You begin to notice your body throughout the day, not in a forced way, but in a quiet, ongoing awareness, a check-in, a sensing, a presence. And in that presence, you stay aligned. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to avoid the extremes. Enough to maintain balance. Enough to keep your energy stable. This also changes how you experience emotions, because you begin to feel them in the body, instead of only thinking about them. You notice how sadness feels, how anxiety feels, how stress feels, as sensations. And when you stay with those sensations, without turning them into stories, they move, they shift, they release. And that release restores energy, because you are not holding the emotion. You are allowing it to pass through the body, naturally. This is one of the deeper aspects of healing. Not understanding everything, but feeling what is there, fully, and letting it move. And the body is where that movement happens. So when you reconnect with it, you reconnect with the natural process of release, without forcing, without controlling, without needing to fix. This is what reduces emotional overload. Because you are no longer holding everything in the mind, you are allowing it to move through the body, where it can complete itself. And once it completes, it does not stay, it passes. And with that passing, there is space, there is lightness, there is energy. Not because you created it, but because you stopped blocking it. This is why the body is such an important teacher. It shows you what is happening before you understand it. It guides you. Before things become too much, it reflects your state in real time, but only if you listen, only if you pay attention, only if you are willing to feel instead of ignore. So the next time you feel tired, do not only look at your thoughts, look at your body. Notice what it is telling you, not with judgment, but with curiosity. What is tight? What is heavy? What is asking for attention? And instead of pushing through, pause, listen, respond, even in small ways, because small adjustments prevent large exhaustion. Small awareness prevents deep burnout. And over time, this changes everything. You become more connected, more responsive, more aligned, not because you are trying harder, but because you are listening better. And in that listening, energy returns, not in bursts, but in steadiness. A quiet, sustainable energy that comes from being in tune with yourself. Because you are no longer ignoring the signals, you are learning from them. And that learning is what keeps you balanced, what keeps you aware, what keeps you from reaching the point of collapse. Because you no longer wait until it is too much. You notice before it becomes too much. And that is the wisdom of the body, simple, direct, always present. And when you trust it, you begin to move through life with less strain, less resistance, less exhaustion, because you are no longer disconnected. You are here, in your body, feeling, listening, responding, and in that connection, you find something that has been missing, a sense of stability, a sense of grounding, a sense that you are supported from within. And from that place, healing continues, not as something you chase, but as something you live, moment by moment, sensation by sensation, without force, because for the first time, you are not ignoring yourself, you are listening, and in that listening, you begin to recover, naturally, fully, from the inside out. And as you begin to listen to your body, as you start noticing the early signals before exhaustion takes over, something else becomes clearer in a very quiet way, because sometimes the tension in your chest, the heaviness in your shoulders, the tightness in your breath, is not coming from your own life. It is coming from what you are carrying for others, not physically, but emotionally, and without realizing it. You have been holding things that were never yours to hold. Let's go deeper. There is a pattern that often hides behind kindness, behind care, behind the desire to help. It begins with something simple. You see someone struggling, you feel their pain, you want to ease it, and so you step in, you listen, you support, you try to fix, you try to take some of that weight away from them. At first, this feels right. It feels human. It feels like connection. But slowly, something begins to shift. You are no longer just supporting. You are carrying, not just understanding, but absorbing. Not just being there, but becoming responsible. And that responsibility is not always visible. It does not show up as a clear task. It shows up as a feeling, a heaviness, a sense that you need to make things better, that you need to help them avoid pain, that you need to protect them from consequences, and without noticing it, you begin to take on what does not belong to you. This is where the exhaustion begins, not from your own experience, but from holding someone else's, because every person has their own path, their own actions, their own consequences, and in Buddhist understanding, this is what is called karma, not as punishment, but as cause and effect. Each action leads to a result. Each choice creates an outcome, and those outcomes belong to the one who created them. But when you step in and try to carry those outcomes, you interrupt that process, not always in a visible way, but internally. You begin to feel what they should be feeling. You begin to worry about what they are going through. You begin to think about how to solve what they are facing. And in doing so, you take on their burden, even if they did not ask you to, even if they are not aware of it. You carry it because you feel connected, because you care, because you do not want to see them suffer. But this is where a deeper truth begins to emerge. Caring does not require carrying. Supporting does not require absorbing. Being present does not require taking ownership. Each person's experience is theirs. And when you take it on, you do not help them grow. You reduce your own capacity. Because your energy is being used for something that is not yours to resolve. This is what creates emotional overload, not just from your own life, but from the lives of others, from their decisions, their struggles, their consequences. And the more you take on, the less space you have for yourself, the less clarity you have, the less energy you have, until eventually you feel drained. Not because you have done something wrong, but because you have taken on too much. This is where the practice of letting others carry their karma begins, not as detachment, but as understanding, a recognition that each person must walk their own path, that each experience is part of their learning, that each consequence belongs to their choices. And when you interfere, you take away that opportunity, not intentionally, but naturally. Because growth comes from experience, from facing what arises, from learning through consequence. And when you remove that, you create dependency, not strength. So the shift is not about becoming distant, it is about becoming clear. Clear about what is yours and what is not. Clear about where your responsibility ends and where another's begins. This clarity is what protects your energy, because you are no longer carrying everything. You are only holding what belongs to you. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you care differently. You listen without absorbing. You support without fixing. You offer presence without taking control. And in that way, you remain connected without becoming overwhelmed. This requires awareness, because the habit of carrying is often automatic. You feel something and you take it in. You see someone struggling and you try to solve it. You notice discomfort and you try to remove it. But not every discomfort needs to be removed. Not every struggle needs to be solved by you. Not every consequence needs to be softened. Sometimes the most supportive thing you can do is to allow someone to face their own experience, without interference, without rescue, without taking it on yourself. This is not easy, because it goes against the instinct to help, to protect, to ease suffering. But true support is not always about removing pain. It is about being present while allowing growth. And growth often requires discomfort. This is where boundaries become important, not rigid boundaries, but clear ones. You begin to notice when you are taking on too much, when you are thinking about someone else's situation constantly, when you are feeling responsible for their outcomes, when your energy is being drained by something that is not yours, and instead of continuing, you step back, not abruptly, but gently. You remind yourself, this is not mine to carry. That reminder brings you back to your own center, back to your own experience, back to your own energy, and from that place, you can still care, but without losing yourself. This also changes how you relate to guilt, because often, letting go of someone else's burden can feel wrong. You may feel like you are abandoning them, like you are not doing enough, like you should be more involved. But this feeling comes from a misunderstanding. You are not responsible for everything. You are not required to fix every situation. You are not meant to carry what belongs to someone else. And recognizing that is not selfish, it is balanced, because when you carry too much, you become exhausted. And in that exhaustion, you are less able to support anyone, including yourself. So letting others carry their karma is not about doing less. It is about doing what is appropriate, what is aligned, what is sustainable. It is about respecting the natural flow of cause and effect without interfering unnecessarily. This creates space, not distance, but clarity. A space where you can be present without being overwhelmed, where you can support without losing energy, where you can care without carrying everything. And in that space, there is balance. A balance between connection and independence, between support and responsibility, between care and self-preservation. This balance restores energy, because you are no longer overextended. You are no longer stretched beyond your capacity. You are grounded in what is yours. And that grounding stabilizes you. It allows you to move through life without constant emotional weight, without carrying what does not belong to you, without being pulled into every situation. This also changes how you experience relationships. They become lighter, less intense, more stable, because you are not trying to control outcomes. You are not trying to fix everything. You are simply present. And that presence is enough. It does not require you to absorb. It does not require you to carry. It allows each person to be responsible for their own path. And in that responsibility, there is growth for them and for you, because you are learning to trust that others can handle their own experiences, to trust that you do not need to intervene in everything, to trust that letting go is sometimes the most supportive action, and that trust reduces exhaustion, because you are no longer holding everything together. You are allowing things to unfold naturally, without force, without interference. So the next time you feel the urge to take on someone else's burden, pause, notice it, and gently ask yourself, is this mine to carry? And if the answer is no, let it go. Not with resistance, but with understanding. Allow them to walk their path. Allow them to experience their consequences. Allow them to grow through what they are facing, and return to yourself, to your breath, to your body, to your own experience, because that is where your energy belongs. And when you keep it there, you remain whole, you remain stable, you remain present, And from that place, you can still care, but without being consumed. You can still support, but without being drained. You can still connect, but without losing yourself. And that is where emotional exhaustion begins to lift. Not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer carrying what was never yours. And in that release, there is lightness, there is space, there is energy, returning, quietly, naturally, without force, because for the first time, you are not holding everything together. You are allowing things to be, and in that allowing you begin to rest deeply, fully, without the weight of others on your shoulders. And from there, healing continues, steady, balanced, real. You've been carrying more than you realized, not just your thoughts, but your stories. Not just your emotions, but your resistance to them. Not just your life, but the weight of others, the pressure of time, the need to be understood, the habit of overthinking, the pull toward intensity. And slowly, all of it turned into exhaustion. But now something has shifted. You've seen that your energy didn't disappear. It was being drained by replaying the past, by rushing to fix every feeling.